The gavel struck the wooden block with a thunderous crack that seemed to echo through the very soul of everyone present in courtroom 4B of the Jefferson County Superior Court. The sound reverberated off the mahogany walls, bouncing between the rows of packed wooden benches where families, friends, and curious onlookers sat in stunned silence. The morning light filtered through the tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. But the atmosphere was anything but bright. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man in his early 60s with silver hair that seemed to reflect his years of judicial experience, sat behind the elevated bench like a figure carved from stone. His black robes draped around him gave him an almost mythical presence, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed the courtroom with the cold precision of someone who had delivered countless verdicts throughout his career. Today, however, felt different. Today carried a weight that even his decades of experience couldn't fully prepare him for. In the defendant's chair sat 17-year-old Terrell Johnson, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white from the pressure of his grip. His dark brown skin seemed to have lost its natural glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, and his usually bright eyes were now clouded with a mixture of fear, confusion, and barely contained anguish. He wore a navy blue suit that his mother had bought specifically for this trial, a suit that was meant to project respectability and innocence but now felt like a costume in a play where he didn't know his lines. The teenager's shoulders were hunched slightly forward, as if trying to make himself smaller, to disappear from the scrutiny of the dozens of eyes that bore into him from every corner of the room. His breathing was shallow, controlled, the kind of breathing that comes from trying desperately not to break down in front of a room full of strangers who held his future in their hands. To his left sat his court-appointed attorney, Public Defender Stevens, a middle-aged white man with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. Stevens had handled hundreds of cases like this one, or so he told himself, but the truth was that no case was quite like this one. The evidence was circumstantial at best, built on assumptions and prejudices rather than concrete facts. But the system had a way of turning assumptions into convictions, especially when the defendant looked like Terrell. Behind the defendant's table in the first row of the gallery sat Jasmine Johnson, Terrell's mother. At 43, she was a woman who had aged gracefully despite the hardships life had thrown her way, but today she looked every bit her age and more. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore her best dress, a simple black number that she had worn to church services and job interviews alike. Her hands were folded in her lap, but they trembled slightly, betraying the calm exterior she was desperately trying to maintain. Jasmine's eyes never left her son's back, as if her gaze alone could provide him with the strength he needed to get through this moment. She had raised Terrell by herself since he was 8 years old, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She had watched him grow from a curious little boy who asked endless questions into a thoughtful teenager who dreamed of becoming an engineer. Now, all of those dreams hung in the balance, waiting for the words that would either set him free or lock him away forever. The courtroom was unusually full for a weekday afternoon. Word had spread throughout the community about the case, and people had come to witness what many believed was a grave injustice in the making. There were teachers from Terrell's high school, neighbors from his apartment complex, and members of the local community center where he had volunteered tutoring younger children in mathematics. They sat in solidarity, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and dread. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the thick silence like a knife. He looked down at the papers in front of him, papers that contained the jury's verdict, papers that would determine the course of a young man's life. The jury, composed of 8 whites and 4 blacks, had deliberated for just over 6 hours before reaching their decision. 6 hours to decide whether a 17-year-old boy would spend the rest of his life behind bars or walk free to pursue the dreams that had been put on hold by this nightmare. The prosecutor, Rebecca Sterling, sat at her table with a look of grim satisfaction on her face. Sterling was known throughout Jefferson County as a tough prosecutor who didn't back down from difficult cases. She was in her late 40s with short blonde hair and sharp features that seemed permanently set in an expression of determination. She had built her career on securing convictions, and this case represented another victory in her quest to clean up the streets and make the community safer. Sterling had painted Terrell as a dangerous young man who had chosen the path of violence despite having opportunities that many others didn't. She had argued that his age shouldn't be a factor in the severity of his punishment, that the crime was heinous enough to warrant the harshest possible sentence. Throughout the trial, she had systematically dismantled the defense's arguments, presenting a narrative that portrayed Terrell not as a confused teenager, but as a calculated criminal who posed a threat to society. The victim's family sat in the front row on the prosecutor's side of the courtroom. They were a white family from the affluent part of town, and their presence served as a constant reminder of the life that had been lost and the pain that had been inflicted. The victim's mother, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and red-rimmed eyes, clutched a tissue in her hand and stared at Terrell with a mixture of grief and anger. Her son had been 22 years old, just starting his career, when his life had been cut short in what the prosecution described as a senseless act of violence. Judge Harrison lifted his eyes from the papers and surveyed the courtroom one final time. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. He had presided over many cases involving young defendants, and each one troubled him in its own way. The criminal justice system was supposed to balance punishment with rehabilitation, to consider not just the crime, but the circumstances surrounding it and the potential for redemption. But public pressure and political considerations often made such nuanced decisions difficult. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the authority of his position, but also a trace of something that might have been regret. The jury has reached a verdict in the case of the state versus Terrell Johnson. Would the defendant please rise? Terrell pushed back his chair and stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Public Defender Stevens rose beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his client's shoulder, though the gesture felt hollow given the circumstances. The teenager's heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. His mouth was dry and he found it difficult to swallow. Behind him, Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in her throat. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day her son was arrested. She had prayed every night, had attended every court hearing, had believed in her heart that justice would prevail and her innocent child would come home. But as she looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of the jurors who had deliberated her son's fate, she felt a growing sense of dread. Judge Harrison looked directly at Terrell, his gray eyes meeting the teenager's frightened gaze. For a moment, the two seemed to be the only people in the room, connected by the gravity of what was about to unfold. The judge had seen many young men and women stand where Terrell now stood, and he had delivered sentences that had changed their lives forever. But something about this case, something about this particular young man, had bothered him throughout the proceedings. "Terrell Johnson," the judge began, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on the charge of first-degree murder. The jury has also found that the crime was committed during the commission of a felony, which qualifies this case for enhanced sentencing under state law." The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Gasps erupted from the gallery, and Jasmine's composure finally cracked as she let out a strangled sob. The sound was heartbreaking, the cry of a mother watching her child's life being destroyed before her eyes. Several people in the community section of the gallery bowed their heads, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Terrell's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The guilty verdict, while not entirely unexpected given the way the trial had proceeded, still felt like a devastating punch to the gut. He had maintained his innocence throughout the entire process, had cooperated with the police, had trusted that the truth would eventually come to light. Now, as he stood facing the man who would determine his punishment, he felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Public Defender Stevens' hand tightened on Terrell's shoulder, but there was little comfort he could provide at this moment. He had done his best with limited resources and an uphill battle from the start. The evidence against his client had been circumstantial, but it had been presented effectively by a skilled prosecutor who knew how to work a jury. Stevens had argued for reasonable doubt, had pointed out the inconsistencies in witness testimony, but ultimately the jury had chosen to believe the state's version of events. Judge Harrison continued, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested this was not an easy decision for him to make. Given the severity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it, this court is required to consider the full range of sentencing options available under state law. The prosecution has requested the maximum penalty, arguing that the defendant poses a continuing threat to public safety and that the heinous nature of the crime warrants the harshest possible punishment. Rebecca Sterling nodded slightly from her position at the prosecutor's table. She had indeed argued for the maximum sentence, believing that sending a strong message was necessary to deter others from committing similar crimes. In her view, Terrell's age was irrelevant when weighed against the severity of his actions and the need to protect the community from dangerous individuals. The victim's family sat in stony silence, their faces reflecting the pain of their loss and their desire for justice. They had attended every day of the trial, had listened to testimony that forced them to relive the worst day of their lives over and over again. For them, nothing could bring back their loved one, but they hoped that a severe sentence might provide some measure of closure and ensure that no other family would suffer as they had. Judge Harrison paused, allowing his words to sink in throughout the courtroom. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every person present understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment, not just in Terrell's life, but in the ongoing struggle for justice and fairness in a system that too often seemed to fall short of its ideals. However, the judge continued, and that single word seemed to offer a glimmer of hope to those who supported Terrell, this court must also consider the defendant's age, his lack of prior criminal history, and the circumstances of his upbringing. The defense has presented evidence of the defendant's academic achievements, his community service, and the testimony of teachers and mentors who speak to his character. Jasmine looked up hopefully, tears streaming down her face. Perhaps the judge had seen what she had always known about her son, that he was a good kid who had somehow found himself in an impossible situation. Perhaps there was still a chance for mercy, for a sentence that would allow Terrell to eventually rebuild his life and contribute to society. But Judge Harrison's expression remained grave as he delivered the final blow. Nevertheless, the court finds that the evidence presented during this trial, combined with the jury's verdict, requires a sentence that reflects the seriousness of the crime committed. Terrell Johnson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Jasmine's scream pierced the air, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Members of the community section shouted their outrage, while the victim's family sat in stunned silence, processing the finality of the sentence. Court security moved quickly to restore order, but the damage was done. The sentence had been delivered, and there was no taking it back. Terrell stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. Life without parole. The words echoed in his mind, but they seemed to belong to someone else's story, not his own. At 17 years old, he was being told that he would never again walk free, would never attend college, would never have a family, would never realize any of the dreams that had sustained him through his difficult childhood. As the bailiff approached to take him into custody, Terrell turned to look at his mother one last time. Jasmine was being consoled by friends and community members, but her eyes never left her son's face. In that moment, as their gazes met across the chaos of the courtroom, both mother and son understood that their lives had been irrevocably changed forever. Public Defender Stevens was already talking about appeals, about fighting the sentence, but his words seemed to come from a great distance. Terrell felt as if he was watching everything happen to someone else, as if he was observing this tragedy from outside his own body. The handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, cold metal against his skin, and he was led away from the only life he had ever known. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the weight of what had just occurred settled over everyone present. A 17-year-old boy had just been sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison, and while the legal system had run its course, many questions remained unanswered. Was this justice, or was this another example of a system that too often failed young people of color? The debate would continue long after the courtroom had emptied, but for Terrell Johnson, the immediate future was clear and terrifying. The holding cell in the basement of the Jefferson County Courthouse was a sterile, gray concrete box that seemed designed to strip away any remaining hope from those unfortunate enough to find themselves within its walls. The single fluorescent light overhead buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows that danced across the bare walls like ghosts of dreams that would never be realized. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair, a combination that had become as familiar to the building's occupants as their own breathing. Terrell sat on the narrow metal bench that served as the cell's only furniture, his head buried in his hands. The navy blue suit that his mother had purchased for the trial now felt like a costume from a play that had ended badly, the fabric wrinkled from hours of sitting and the weight of devastating news. His hands shook slightly as he tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred upstairs in that courtroom. Life without parole. The words echoed in his mind like a broken record, each repetition driving home the finality of his situation. At 17 years old, he had just been told that he would never again experience freedom, would never walk down a street without shackles, would never hold a job or start a family or contribute to society in any meaningful way. The future that had once seemed bright with possibility had been reduced to decades of concrete walls and steel bars. The teenager's thoughts drifted to his mother, to the sound of her anguished scream when the sentence was read. Jasmine had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities, had worked multiple jobs and gone without necessities to ensure that he had books, clothes, and a chance at a better life. Now all of that sacrifice seemed meaningless, destroyed by circumstances that neither of them could have predicted or controlled. Terrell thought about his younger sister Destiny, who was away at college on a scholarship that Jasmine had helped her earn through years of saving and planning. Destiny was studying pre-med with dreams of becoming a doctor, dreams that now seemed impossibly distant from the reality that had become Terrell's world. How would she react to the news that her big brother, the one who had helped her with homework and protected her from neighborhood bullies, would be spending the rest of his life in prison? The sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor outside his cell broke through Terrell's tortured thoughts. Officer Graham, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed out of place in such a harsh environment, approached the bars. Graham had been working at the courthouse for over 20 years, and in that time, he had seen hundreds of young people pass through these cells. Something about Terrell's case had bothered him from the beginning, but it wasn't his place to question the decisions made by judges and juries. "Johnson," Officer Graham said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. "You're allowed one phone call before transport. You want to make it now?" Terrell looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. The concept of a phone call seemed almost abstract in the face of everything that had just happened. Who could he call? What could he possibly say to anyone that would make sense of this nightmare? But as he considered his options, one name came to mind, one person who might be able to help him understand how his life had taken such a devastating turn. "Yeah," Terrell said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to call my dad." Officer Graham nodded and unlocked the cell door, leading Terrell down a short hallway to a small room that contained nothing but a metal table, 2 chairs, and an old rotary phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. The walls were bare except for a faded poster outlining the rights of prisoners, rights that seemed meaningless in the face of a life sentence without parole. "You've got 15 minutes, Graham said, stepping back to give Terrell some privacy while still maintaining visual contact as required by prison protocol. "Make it count." Terrell sat down heavily in one of the metal chairs and stared at the phone for a long moment. He hadn't spoken to his father in over 3 months, not since their last argument about Terrell's choice of friends and his late-night activities. Antoine Johnson was a busy man with little patience for teenage rebellion, and their relationship had become strained over the past year as Terrell struggled to find his place in the world. But Antoine was also one of the most powerful men in the country, the United States Attorney General, a position he had held for the past 2 years after a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. If anyone could help Terrell understand what had just happened, if anyone had the knowledge and influence to potentially change the course of events, it would be his father. Terrell picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the number he had memorized years ago but rarely used. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before being answered by a crisp, professional voice that Terrell didn't recognize. "Office of the Attorney General, this is Margaret speaking. How may I direct your call?" "I need to speak with Attorney General Johnson," Terrell said, his voice stronger than he had expected. "This is his son." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing on a keyboard. Margaret, whoever she was probably checking some sort of list or schedule, determining whether the Attorney General's son warranted immediate access to one of the busiest men in Washington. "I'm sorry, but the Attorney General is currently in a meeting with congressional leadership," Margaret replied, her voice polite but firm. "May I take a message and have him return your call?" "No," Terrell said, more forcefully this time. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, and he realized that this might be his only chance to reach his father before being transported to whatever prison would become his permanent home. "You need to get him out of that meeting. Tell him that Terrell needs to speak with him right now. Tell him it's an emergency." Margaret's tone shifted slightly, becoming less bureaucratic and more concerned. "Is this regarding a family emergency, Mr. Johnson?" "Yes," Terrell said simply. "It is." Another pause, longer this time, followed by the sound of muffled conversation as Margaret apparently consulted with someone else in the office. Terrell gripped the phone receiver tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure, as he waited for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. "Please hold, Mr. Johnson," Margaret finally said. "I'm connecting you now." The line went quiet, except for a soft clicking sound. And then Terrell heard the familiar voice of his father, though it carried the strain and weariness that seemed to be an occupational hazard for anyone who worked at the highest levels of government. "Terrell?" Antoine's voice came through the phone line clearly, tinged with concern and confusion. "Margaret said this was an emergency. What's going on? Are you all right?" For a moment, Terrell couldn't find the words. How do you tell your father, especially a father who had dedicated his life to law and order, that you've just been sentenced to life in prison? How do you explain that everything he had worked to build, the family name and reputation that had opened doors throughout his career, was now associated with a conviction for first-degree murder? "Dad," Terrell began, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm in trouble. Big trouble." Antoine's tone immediately became more focused, more intense. Years of prosecuting criminal cases had taught him to recognize when a conversation was about to take a serious turn. "What kind of trouble, son? Where are you?" "I'm in a holding cell at the Jefferson County Courthouse," Terrell said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I just got sentenced to life in prison without parole for first-degree murder, and I didn't do it, Dad. I swear to you, I didn't do it." The silence that followed was so complete that Terrell wondered if the connection had been lost. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he waited for his father's response, hoping against hope that Antoine would immediately know what to do, would somehow be able to fix this nightmare with the same efficiency he brought to all the other challenges in his professional life. When Antoine finally spoke, His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Life without parole? Terrell, that's not possible. You're 17 years old. There has to be some mistake. That's what I thought, too, Terrell replied, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. But Judge Harrison read the sentence himself. The jury found me guilty, and now they're going to transfer me to state prison. Dad, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Antoine was quiet for another moment, and Terrell could almost hear the wheels turning in his father's mind as he tried to process this information. The Attorney General had dealt with thousands of criminal cases throughout his career, but none of them had involved his own child. The personal and professional implications of this situation were staggering. "Tell me exactly what happened," Antoine said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when gathering facts for a case. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Terrell took a shaky breath and began to recount the events that had led to this moment. He told his father about the night 3 months ago when he had been hanging out with friends in the wrong part of town, about the shooting that had occurred while he was there, about his arrest the following day when police identified him as a suspect. He explained how his court-appointed attorney had seemed overwhelmed and underprepared, how the prosecutor had painted him as a dangerous criminal despite his lack of any prior record. As Terrell spoke, Antoine listened in growing horror. The case his son described sounded like a textbook example of prosecutorial overreach combined with inadequate defense representation. The evidence appeared to be largely circumstantial, based primarily on the testimony of witnesses whose credibility was questionable at best. Most troubling of all was the fact that the prosecutor had sought an adult sentence for a juvenile defendant without exploring alternative options. "The lawyer you had," Antoine interrupted. "This public defender Stevens, did he investigate alibi witnesses? Did he challenge the reliability of the identification? Did he file any motions to have the case moved to juvenile court?" "I don't think so," Terrell replied, his voice growing smaller with each question. "He met with me maybe 3 times before the trial, and each time he seemed like he was in a hurry to get somewhere else. He kept telling me that the state had a strong case and that I should consider taking a plea deal." Antoine felt his anger rising, not at his son, but at a system that had clearly failed to provide adequate representation to a 17-year-old boy facing the most serious charges possible. As the nation's top law enforcement officer, he understood better than most how the criminal justice system was supposed to work, and what Terrell was describing bore little resemblance to the fair and thorough process that every defendant deserved. "Dad," Terrell continued, his voice breaking with emotion, "I keep thinking about Mom, about how she sounded when they read the sentence. She's been working so hard to take care of us, and now this is going to destroy her. And Destiny, she's going to find out that her brother is a convicted murderer. How is she supposed to deal with that?" The mention of Jasmine and Destiny hit Antoine like a physical blow. Despite their divorce and the complicated relationship that had followed, he still cared deeply about his ex-wife and both of his children. The thought of Jasmine having to endure the shame and heartbreak of having a son in prison, and of Destiny having to carry the burden of her brother's conviction, was almost unbearable. "Listen to me, Terrell," Antoine said, his voice taking on the authority and determination that had made him one of the most respected prosecutors in the country. "I want you to stay strong, and I want you to remember that this is not over. A sentence is just the beginning of the process, not the end. There are appeals, there are motions for new trials, there are any number of legal remedies that we can pursue." "But what if they don't work?" Terrell asked, his voice small and frightened. "What if I really do have to spend the rest of my life in prison for something I didn't do?" Antoine was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully. As Attorney General, he was committed to upholding the rule of law and supporting the decisions made by courts throughout the country. But as a father, he was committed to protecting his child and ensuring that justice was truly served. Sometimes those two commitments came into conflict, and this was clearly going to be one of those times. "That's not going to happen," Antoine said firmly. "I give you my word as your father and as an officer of the court. We are going to find a way to fix this. I'm going to make some calls as soon as we hang up, and I'm going to find you the best criminal defense attorney in the state. We're going to turn over every stone, challenge every piece of evidence, and make sure that your case gets the attention it deserves." Terrell felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the verdict had been read. If anyone could navigate the complex legal system and find a way to overturn his conviction, it was his father. Antoine had connections throughout the legal community, resources that most families could never access, and a deep understanding of how the system worked at every level. "There's something else," Antoine continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm going to personally review this case file, and if I find evidence of prosecutorial misconduct or inadequate defense representation, there are going to be consequences. The system failed you, son, and that's not acceptable." Officer Graham tapped on his watch, indicating that Terrell's 15 minutes were nearly up. The teenager nodded and turned his attention back to the phone call that had given him the first ray of hope in what had been the darkest day of his young life. "I have to go, Dad," Terrell said reluctantly. "They're going to transport me soon." "I love you, son," Antoine said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm going to fix this. I promise you that. Stay strong, trust the process, and remember that you have people fighting for you." As Terrell hung up the phone and followed Officer Graham back to his holding cell, he felt different than he had an hour earlier. The situation was still terrible. The sentence was still devastating. But now he wasn't facing it alone. His father, one of the most powerful men in the country, was going to fight for him. And if anyone could challenge a system that had clearly failed, it was the United States Attorney General. The United States Department of Justice building stood like a fortress in the heart of Washington, D.C., its imposing limestone facade reflecting the gravity of the work conducted within its walls. From his office on the 5th floor, Attorney General Antoine Johnson could see the Capitol building in the distance, a reminder of the democratic principles and constitutional protections that formed the foundation of American law. Today, however, those principles felt more like distant ideals than practical realities. Antoine sat behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by law books, case files, and the various awards and commendations he had received throughout his distinguished career. The office itself was a testament to his journey from a working-class neighborhood in Detroit to the highest law enforcement position in the land. Framed photographs showed him meeting with presidents, addressing Congress, and receiving honorary degrees from prestigious universities. But none of those achievements seemed to matter now, not when his own son was sitting in a jail cell, convicted of a crime Antoine increasingly believed he didn't commit. The phone call from Terrell had ended 3 hours ago, but Antoine could still hear the fear and desperation in his son's voice. Life without parole for a 17-year-old boy was a sentence so severe that it defied comprehension, especially when the evidence appeared to be as weak as what Terrell had described. As both a father and a career prosecutor, Antoine understood that something had gone terribly wrong in Jefferson County, and he was determined to find out exactly what that was. Margaret, his executive assistant, knocked quietly on the door before entering with a stack of files under her arm. She was a woman in her 50s who had worked for 3 different attorneys general, and her efficiency and discretion had made her invaluable to the smooth operation of the office. Today, however, her usually composed expression carried traces of concern and sympathy. "I have the information you requested regarding your son's case," Margaret said, setting the files on Antoine's desk with careful precision. "I also took the liberty of compiling background information on the key players involved in the prosecution." Antoine looked up from the legal pad where he had been making notes, his expression grim. "What did you find?" Margaret opened the first file, revealing a photograph of Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling clipped to the front page. Rebecca Sterling, the lead prosecutor, has been with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office for 12 years. Her conviction rate is impressive, roughly 87%, but several of her cases have been overturned on appeal due to prosecutorial misconduct. There have been allegations of withholding exculpatory evidence, making inappropriate statements to the media, and pursuing charges that exceed what the evidence supports. Antoine studied Sterling's photograph, noting the sharp features and calculating expression that seemed to suggest someone more interested in winning than in seeking justice. "What about the defense attorney?" "Public Defender Stevens," Margaret continued, opening another file. "He's been handling criminal cases for 8 years, but his caseload is enormous. According to the records I was able to access, he's currently representing over 200 defendants simultaneously. The State Bar Association has cited his office multiple times for inadequate representation due to resource constraints." The numbers made Antoine's jaw clench with anger. 200 cases for a single attorney meant that each defendant received a fraction of the attention their case deserved. It was a systemic problem that affected poor defendants throughout the country, but knowing that his own son had been caught in that broken system made the injustice feel personal and immediate. "And the judge?" Antoine asked, though he suspected he already knew what Margaret would tell him. "Judge Harrison has been on the bench for 18 years, Margaret replied, consulting her notes. "His sentencing patterns show a clear bias toward maximum penalties, particularly in cases involving young defendants of color. Civil rights organizations have filed multiple complaints alleging discriminatory sentencing practices, but the State Judicial Conduct Board has declined to take action." Juan leaned back in his chair, processing the information Margaret had compiled. What was emerging was a picture of a criminal justice system that had failed at every level to provide his son with fair treatment. The prosecutor appeared to be more interested in maintaining her conviction rate than in seeking truth. The defense attorney was too overwhelmed to provide adequate representation, and the judge had a documented history of discriminatory sentencing. "There's more," Margaret said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was about to deliver particularly disturbing news. "I spoke with contacts at the FBI field office in Jefferson County, and they indicated that there have been ongoing concerns about corruption within the local police department. Several officers have been under federal investigation for evidence tampering and witness intimidation." This revelation hit Antoine like a physical blow. If the police investigation had been compromised from the beginning, then everything that followed, from the arrest to the trial to the conviction, was potentially tainted. As Attorney General, he had the authority to order federal investigations into local law enforcement agencies, but using that power to help his own son would raise serious ethical questions about the abuse of office. Antoine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been his home for the past 2 years. Washington was a place where power and principle often came into conflict, where good people were forced to make difficult choices between what was right and what was politically expedient. Today, he was facing the most difficult choice of his career, one that would define not only his legacy, but also his relationship with his son and his commitment to justice. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret's voice came through the intercom, sounding more urgent than usual. "Sir, I have Denzel Harper on line 1. He says it's regarding your son's case." Antoine turned from the window, surprised by the unexpected call. Denzel Harper was one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in the country, with a reputation for taking on difficult cases and achieving remarkable results. He had built his practice on defending clients who had been failed by the system, often pro bono, and his courtroom skills were legendary among both prosecutors and defense attorneys. "Put him through," Antoine said, returning to his desk and picking up the phone. "Denzel, this is a surprise." "Antoine," Denzel's voice came through clearly, carrying the warmth and confidence that had made him such an effective advocate. "I heard about your son's situation through the legal network. Word travels fast when something this egregious happens to someone in our community. Antoine felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. The idea that his personal tragedy was becoming known throughout the legal community was troubling, but having someone of Denzel's caliber reach out offered a glimmer of hope. "I appreciate you calling," Antoine replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I have to ask how you heard about this so quickly." "I have contacts in courtrooms across the country," Denzel explained. "When a 17-year-old gets sentenced to life without parole, especially the son of the Attorney General, people take notice. From what I've been told, this case has all the hallmarks of a wrongful conviction." Antoine sank back into his chair, running his hand over his face. "The evidence against him appears to be entirely circumstantial. The defense was clearly inadequate, and the prosecution seems to have been more interested in securing a conviction than seeking justice. But proving any of that in court is going to be an uphill battle." "That's exactly why I'm calling," Denzel said, his voice taking on the focused intensity that made him such a formidable advocate. "I want to handle your son's appeal pro bono. This case represents everything that's wrong with our criminal justice system, and I believe we can not only get Terrell's conviction overturned, but also expose the corruption that led to this travesty." The offer was more than Antoine had dared to hope for. Denzel Harper's involvement would transform Terrell's case from a routine appeal handled by an overworked public defender into a high-profile challenge to systemic injustice. But accepting the offer would also mean acknowledging publicly that the Attorney General's own son had been failed by the very system Antoine was sworn to uphold. "Denzel, I can't begin to tell you how much I appreciate this offer," Antoine said carefully. "But you understand the position this puts me in. If the Attorney General's son receives special treatment, if he gets representation that other defendants can't afford, it raises serious questions about equal justice under law." "I understand your concerns," Denzel replied, "but consider the alternative. If we don't fight this conviction with everything we have, if we allow a 17-year-old boy to spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, what message does that send about the system you've dedicated your life to serving?" Antoine was quiet for a moment, wrestling with the ethical implications of the decision he was being asked to make. As a prosecutor, he had always believed that the system worked when it was allowed to function properly, that truth and justice would ultimately prevail when dedicated professionals did their jobs with integrity and skill. But Terrell's case suggested that sometimes the system failed so completely that extraordinary measures were required to restore balance. "What would be your first step?" Antoine asked, his voice indicating that he was seriously considering the offer. "I would immediately file a motion for a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel," Denzel explained. "From what I've heard, Public Defender Stevens failed to investigate basic elements of the case, didn't challenge questionable evidence, and never explored plea negotiations that might have resulted in a juvenile sentence. That's textbook ineffective assistance. And if that doesn't work, then we go to the state appellate court with every argument we can make. Prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, inadequate investigation, witness tampering. We turn over every stone and challenge every aspect of this conviction until we find the crack that brings the whole thing down." Antoine felt his resolve strengthening as Denzel outlined his strategy. This wasn't about using influence or political connections to secure special treatment for his son. This was about using the legal system's own mechanisms to correct a fundamental injustice, to ensure that the principles of due process and fair representation weren't just empty promises for those who could afford better. "There's one more thing you should know," Antoine said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "I've received information suggesting that there may have been corruption within the police department that investigated this case. If that's true, it could affect everything from the initial arrest to the evidence presented at trial." Denzel's interest was clearly piqued by this revelation. What kind of corruption are we talking about? Evidence tampering, witness intimidation, possibly even fabrication of testimony, Antoine replied. My sources indicate that the FBI has been investigating several officers in that department, though I don't know if any of them were directly involved in Terrell's case. That changes everything, Denzel said, his voice taking on an edge of excitement. If we can prove that the investigation was compromised, we might be able to get the entire conviction thrown out. Do you have access to the FBI files? This was the moment Antoine had been dreading, the point where his role as Attorney General and his role as a father came into direct conflict. Using his official position to access federal investigation files for the benefit of his son's case would be a clear abuse of power, the kind of ethical violation that could end his career and potentially result in criminal charges. I can't use my official position to help my son's case, Antoine said firmly. That would be an unacceptable conflict of interest. But I can tell you that if there's evidence of federal crimes committed in connection with this case, that evidence should be made available through proper legal channels. I understand, Denzel replied, and Antoine could hear the respect in his voice for the difficult position his colleague was maintaining. We'll pursue this through legitimate discovery motions and public records requests. It might take longer, but it will ensure that any evidence we uncover can be used in court without ethical complications. Antoine felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized that he had found a way to help his son without compromising his principles or his office. Denzel Harper would provide Terrell with the kind of skilled representation that every defendant deserved, while Antoine would continue to uphold the law and maintain the integrity of the Justice Department. So you'll take the case? Antoine asked, though he already knew the answer. I'll take the case, Denzel confirmed. And Antoine, I want you to know that this isn't charity. This case represents an opportunity to challenge systemic injustices that affect thousands of young people across this country. Your son's story is tragic, but it's not unique. By fighting for him, we're fighting for everyone who has been failed by a system that too often prioritizes convictions over truth. As the call ended, Antoine felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving Terrell's devastating phone call. Hope. His son now had one of the country's best defense attorneys working on his behalf, and the legal system that had failed so spectacularly would be forced to confront its own shortcomings. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Antoine believed that justice might ultimately prevail. Margaret knocked on the door again, entering with another stack of files and a concerned expression. Sir, I've been monitoring news coverage of your son's case, and it's starting to attract national attention. Several civil rights organizations have issued statements condemning the sentence, and there are calls for federal intervention. Antoine nodded grimly. He had expected that the case would eventually draw media attention, but he had hoped for more time to develop a legal strategy before the story became a national controversy. Media attention could be a double-edged sword, bringing public pressure that might help Terrell's case while also creating political complications for Antoine's position as Attorney General. What's the tone of the coverage? Antoine asked. Mixed, Margaret replied, consulting her notes. Some outlets are focusing on the severity of the sentence and the apparent weaknesses in the case. Others are questioning whether you'll use your position to help your son, and there are calls for you to recuse yourself from any federal involvement in local criminal justice issues. Antoine had anticipated these questions, and he had already made his decision about how to handle them. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow afternoon, he said firmly. I'm going to address this situation directly and make clear that while I believe in my son's innocence, I will not use my official position to interfere with the legal process. Are you sure that's wise? Margaret asked gently. Once you make public statements about the case, everything you say will be scrutinized and potentially used against your son in court. I'm sure, Antoine replied. The American people deserve to know where I stand on this issue, and more importantly, they deserve to know that the rule of law applies equally to everyone, including the Attorney General's family. As Margaret left to make arrangements for the press conference, Antoine returned to the files she had compiled on his son's case. Somewhere in these documents was the key to understanding how the system had failed so completely and how that failure could be corrected. He would read every page, analyze every piece of evidence, and use his decades of legal experience to help Denzel Harper build the strongest possible case for his son's freedom. But even as he dove into the legal details, Antoine couldn't shake the image of Terrell sitting in that jail cell, scared and alone, facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. No father should have to watch his child suffer such an injustice, and no teenager should have to pay such a devastating price for the failures of a system that was supposed to protect him. The fight for Terrell's freedom was just beginning, but Antoine was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what the personal or professional cost might be. The Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility loomed against the gray October sky like a concrete monument to human failure and lost hope. Built in the 1970s during the height of America's tough-on-crime era, the prison was designed to house 200 inmates but currently held nearly 2,000 men, creating conditions that would test even the strongest spirits. The imposing structure was surrounded by 3 layers of razor-wire-topped fencing, guard towers positioned at strategic intervals, and a perimeter that seemed to extend endlessly in all directions. Terrell sat on the narrow cot in his 6-by-9-foot cell, staring at the concrete walls that had become his entire world. 3 days had passed since his sentencing, 3 days since his life had been reduced to a space barely large enough to contain a bed, a sink, a toilet, and the crushing weight of a future that stretched endlessly ahead of him. The walls were painted in institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone unfortunate enough to call this place home. His cellmate was a man named Curtis, a lifer in his 40s who had been incarcerated for over 20 years. Curtis was a thin man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of decades spent navigating the complex social hierarchy of prison life. When Terrell had first arrived, terrified and overwhelmed, Curtis had taken him under his wing, explaining the unwritten rules that governed survival in this harsh environment. The key to making it in here, Curtis had told him on that first night, is to keep your head down, stay out of other people's business, and never show weakness. The moment these people sense that you're afraid or vulnerable, they'll tear you apart like wolves. Terrell had listened carefully to every word of advice Curtis offered, understanding instinctively that his survival might depend on learning these lessons quickly. At 17, he was one of the youngest inmates in the adult population, a fact that made him a target for both predators and those looking to establish their dominance through violence. The daily routine was mind-numbing in its repetition. Wake up at 5:30 for count, breakfast at 6, work detail from 8 to 11, lunch at noon, more work or educational programs in the afternoon, dinner at 5, and lockdown at 9. Each day blended into the next in a gray monotony that seemed designed to break the human spirit through sheer tedium and hopelessness. During work detail, Terrell was assigned to the prison laundry, a hot, humid environment filled with industrial washing machines and dryers that ran constantly. The work was physically demanding and mind-numbingly repetitive, but it served a purpose beyond the obvious one of keeping inmates occupied. In the laundry, Terrell began to hear stories from other inmates, tales of wrongful convictions, corrupt prosecutors, and a criminal justice system that seemed more interested in filling cells than seeking truth. There was Rodriguez, a 25-year-old serving 15 years for drug trafficking based largely on the testimony of an informant who later recanted his statement. There was Johnson, a middle-aged man doing life for a murder he insisted he didn't commit, whose public defender had slept through portions of his trial. There was Williams, barely 19 years old, serving 25 years for armed robbery despite having an alibi that his attorney failed to properly present to the jury. Each story was different in its details, but the underlying themes were depressingly similar. Inadequate legal representation, prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and a system that seemed designed to produce convictions rather than justice. As Terrell listened to these men share their experiences, he began to understand that his case was not an aberration, but part of a larger pattern of systemic failure. The most difficult part of prison life, however, was not the physical hardships or even the constant threat of violence. It was the crushing psychological weight of knowing that he might never leave this place, that his dreams of college, career, and family had been replaced by an endless succession of identical days in a concrete box. The walls seemed to close in a little more each day, and Terrell found himself struggling to maintain hope in the face of such overwhelming despair. Letters from home provided his only connection to the world beyond the razor wire. His mother wrote every day, filling pages with news about neighbors, updates on his sister's progress in college, and constant reassurances that she believed in his innocence and was working to find a way to bring him home. Reading these letters was both a comfort and a torture, reminding him of everything he had lost while offering the faint possibility that it might someday be restored. His father's letters were less frequent but more substantial, filled with updates on the legal proceedings and strategies being developed for his appeal. Antoine wrote about his conversations with Denzel Harper, about the evidence they were uncovering, and about his growing conviction that the entire case against Terrell was built on a foundation of lies and corruption. "Son," one letter read, "I want you to know that we are making progress. Mr. Harper has uncovered evidence that the police investigation was deeply flawed, and we believe we can prove that key witnesses were coerced into giving false testimony. The road ahead is long and difficult, but I need you to stay strong and never give up hope. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." Terrell read and reread these letters, clinging to them as lifelines in an ocean of despair. The knowledge that his father was fighting for him, that one of the country's best attorneys was working on his case, provided a flickering flame of hope that he protected jealously against the crushing reality of his surroundings. But hope was a fragile thing in a place like this, and there were days when the weight of his situation seemed unbearable. On those days, Terrell would lie on his narrow cot and stare at the ceiling, wondering if his father's promises were just empty words meant to comfort a condemned son, wondering if he would still be in this cell when he was 30, 40, 50 years old. The other inmates had developed various strategies for coping with the psychological challenges of long-term incarceration. Some threw themselves into exercise, spending hours each day working out in their cells or the recreation yard, building their bodies as a way of maintaining some sense of control over their lives. Others turned to religion, finding in faith a source of strength and meaning that the secular world had failed to provide. Curtis had survived 2 decades in prison by becoming a student of the law, spending countless hours in the prison library researching legal precedents and helping other inmates with their appeals. His cell was filled with law books, legal briefs, and handwritten notes covering every aspect of criminal procedure and constitutional law. He had become, in effect, a jailhouse lawyer whose knowledge rivaled that of many formally trained attorneys. "The system is designed to make you give up," Curtis told Terrell one evening as they sat in their cell after lockdown. "They want you to accept that this is your life now, that there's no point in fighting anymore. But the moment you stop fighting, you stop being human. You become just another number in their system." Curtis's words resonated deeply with Terrell, who had been struggling with the temptation to simply accept his fate and try to find some way to make peace with life behind bars. But accepting defeat seemed like a betrayal of everyone who was fighting for him, especially his father, who was risking his reputation and career to seek justice for his son. The prison library became Terrell's refuge, a place where he could escape the harsh realities of his situation and immerse himself in books that transported him to other worlds. He read voraciously, consuming novels, biographies, history, and philosophy with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air. Reading provided not just entertainment but intellectual stimulation that helped keep his mind sharp and his spirit alive. It was in the library that Tyrrell first encountered the writings of men who had endured similar injustices and emerged with their humanity intact. He read about Nelson Mandela's 27 years in prison, about Reuben Carter's fight to overturn his wrongful conviction, about countless others who had faced seemingly insurmountable odds and never given up hope. These stories provided both inspiration and a template for survival. They taught him that dignity could be maintained even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, that the mind could remain free even when the body was confined, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, had a way of eventually prevailing. Tyrrell also began keeping a journal, documenting his experiences and thoughts as a way of maintaining his sanity and preserving his sense of self. Writing became a form of resistance against the institutional forces that sought to reduce him to nothing more than an inmate number. In his journal, he was still Tyrrell Johnson, the young man with dreams and aspirations, not just inmate 24/7/891. Day 23, he wrote one evening. Had a letter from Dad today. He says Mr. Harper thinks they've found evidence that one of the key witnesses against me was threatened by police. If they can prove it, it might be enough to get a new trial. I'm trying not to get my hopes up too high, but I can't help feeling excited about the possibility. Mom says she's been getting calls from reporters who want to interview her about my case. I told her not to talk to them yet. Not until we know more about how the appeal is going. The journal entries became longer and more reflective as the weeks passed, evolving from simple records of daily events to deeper explorations of his thoughts about justice, family, and the meaning of freedom. Writing helped him process the trauma of his situation while maintaining his intellectual and emotional growth despite the oppressive environment. As winter approached, Tyrrell had been in prison for nearly 2 months. The initial shock of his situation had given way to a grim acceptance of his daily routine, but the hope kindled by his father's efforts and Denzel Harper's involvement had never completely died. He had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of prison life, had found ways to occupy his mind and maintain his dignity, and had begun to build a network of relationships with other inmates who shared his commitment to fighting their wrongful convictions. But the most important thing Tyrrell had learned during his time behind bars was that his identity could not be defined by his circumstances. He was not just a prisoner. He was a son, a brother, a student, and a young man with dreams that no conviction could permanently destroy. As long as he held on to that truth, as long as he refused to let the system break his spirit, there remained the possibility of redemption and justice. The concrete walls that surrounded him were real and imposing, but they could not contain his mind, his hope, or his determination to prove his innocence. In the darkness of his cell, as he listened to the sounds of a prison settling into another night, Tyrrell held on to the belief that this nightmare would eventually end, that justice would prevail, and that he would someday walk free to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. The fight for his freedom was being waged in courtrooms and law offices far from his cell, but the most important battle was the one taking place in his own heart and mind. As long as he refused to surrender hope, as long as he maintained his faith in the possibility of justice, the system had not truly defeated him. And that knowledge, more than any letter from home or legal brief filed on his behalf, gave him the strength to face each new day behind prison walls. The law offices of Harper & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Atlanta, a testament to Denzel Harper's success as one of the South's most formidable criminal defense attorneys. The firm's reputation had been built on taking cases that other lawyers considered hopeless, on challenging prosecutorial misconduct, and on securing victories for clients who had been failed by an inadequate legal system. Today, The conference room on the 32nd floor buzzed with activity as Harper's team worked to unravel what they increasingly believed to be one of the most egregious wrongful convictions they had ever encountered. Denzel Harper sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, surrounded by law books, case files, and computer printouts that told the story of Terrell Johnson's arrest, trial, and conviction. At 48 years old, Harper was the imposing figure whose presence commanded attention and respect. His dark skin bore the lines of a man who had spent decades fighting battles in courtrooms across the country, and his intense brown eyes reflected both the compassion that drove him to help the wrongfully accused and the fierce determination that made him such a formidable opponent. Across from Harper sat his lead investigator, Maria Santos, a former FBI agent whose skills at uncovering hidden evidence had made her invaluable to the firm's most complex cases. Santos was a meticulous woman in her 40s whose attention to detail and relentless pursuit of truth had helped overturn dozens of wrongful convictions during her 10-year association with Harper's firm. Today, she was presenting findings that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the case against Terrell Johnson. "What we're looking at here," Santos began, spreading crime scene photographs across the table, "is the investigation that was compromised from the very beginning. The physical evidence collected at the scene was minimal, the witness interviews were conducted improperly, and there are significant gaps in the police timeline that suggest evidence may have been deliberately overlooked or suppressed." Harper studied the photographs intently, his trained eye picking up details that had apparently been missed or ignored by the original investigators. The crime scene was a parking lot behind a convenience store in one of Jefferson County's rougher neighborhoods, a place where violence was unfortunately common and witness cooperation was often scarce. The victim, 22-year-old Kevin Morrison, had been found shot to death near his car, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. "Walk me through what the police say happened," Harper said, though he had already reviewed the official reports multiple times. Santos consulted her notes, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when presenting evidence. According to the police report, Morrison was approached by 3 young men as he was leaving the convenience store around 10:30 p.m. There was an argument, allegedly over Morrison's wallet and jewelry, which escalated into violence. Morrison was shot twice in the chest and died at the scene. The perpetrators fled on foot. "And how did they identify Terrell as one of the perpetrators?" Harper asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 2 witnesses claimed to have seen the incident from across the street, Santos replied. Keenan Williams, age 19, and Marcus Thompson, age 21. Both initially gave vague descriptions of the perpetrators, but after multiple interviews with police, they identified Terrell Johnson from a photo lineup. Harper frowned as he reviewed the witness statements, noting the inconsistencies and changes that had occurred between the initial interviews and the final testimony presented at trial. This was a pattern he had seen in dozens of cases, where witness accounts became more specific and incriminating as the investigation progressed, often suggesting coaching or coercion by law enforcement. "What about the photo lineup?" Harper asked. "Was it conducted properly?" "That's where things get interesting," Santos replied, pulling out additional documents. The lineup was conducted by Detective Coleman, who has since been placed on administrative leave pending a federal investigation into evidence tampering. The photos shown to witnesses were not properly preserved, and there are allegations that witnesses were shown Terrell's photo multiple times before being asked to make an identification. This revelation was exactly the kind of prosecutorial misconduct that Harper specialized in exposing. If witnesses had been improperly coached, or if the photo lineup had been conducted in a suggestive manner, it could be grounds for overturning the entire conviction. But proving such misconduct would require more than allegations. It would require concrete evidence that could stand up in appellate court. "Have we been able to interview the witnesses directly?" Harper asked. Santos's expression grew troubled. "That's where we've hit our first major roadblock. Keenan Williams has apparently left Jefferson County and cannot be located. Marcus Thompson is still in the area, but he's refused to speak with our investigators and has retained an attorney who claims he's being harassed. The disappearance of key witnesses was another red flag that suggested the original investigation had been compromised. In Harper's experience, witnesses in legitimate cases were usually willing to cooperate with defense attorneys, especially when the stakes were as high as a life sentence. The fact that both witnesses were avoiding contact suggested they might have something to hide. Harper's attention was drawn to a knock on the conference room door. His secretary entered carrying a thick manila envelope that she placed on the table with obvious care. "This just arrived by courier," she said. "It's from the FBI field office in Jefferson County, marked for your personal attention." Harper opened the envelope with growing anticipation, knowing that it likely contained the federal investigation files that might hold the key to Terrell's exoneration. What he found inside exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Hundreds of pages of surveillance reports, witness statements, and internal communications that painted a picture of corruption within the Jefferson County Police Department that was far more extensive than he had imagined. "Maria," Harper said, his voice carrying a tone of barely controlled excitement, "you need to see this." Santos moved to look over Harper's shoulder as he spread the FBI documents across the table. What they revealed was a pattern of misconduct that had apparently been ongoing for years, involving multiple officers and touching dozens of criminal cases. Detective Coleman, who had led the investigation into Morrison's murder, was identified as a central figure in a conspiracy to fabricate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and secure convictions through illegal means. "According to this," Santos said, reading from one of the FBI reports, "Coleman was under investigation for planting drugs on suspects, threatening witnesses with arrest if they didn't cooperate, and falsifying police reports to support prosecutorial theories. And look at this timeline." She pointed to a section of the report that documented Coleman's activities during the week of Morrison's murder. The FBI had been conducting surveillance on Coleman as part of their corruption investigation, and their records showed several meetings between Coleman and individuals who were not identified in the official police files. "One of these meetings," Santos continued, "took place the day before Keenan Williams identified Terrell from the photo lineup. Coleman met with an individual whose description matches Williams at a location miles from the police station. There's no record of this meeting in any official documentation." Harper felt his pulse quicken as the implications of this revelation became clear. If the FBI could prove that Coleman had met with key witnesses outside of official channels, it would suggest that witness testimony had been coerced or fabricated. Combined with the evidence of Coleman's broader pattern of misconduct, it could be enough to convince an appellate court that Terrell's conviction was fundamentally tainted. "There's more," Santos said, continuing to review the FBI files. "According to these surveillance reports, Coleman also met with prosecutor Rebecca Sterling on multiple occasions during the investigation, including several meetings at locations outside the courthouse. The timing of these meetings corresponds with significant changes in the prosecution's theory of the case. This was potentially explosive evidence. While prosecutors and police investigators were expected to work together, secret meetings outside of official channels suggested a level of coordination that might have crossed ethical boundaries. If Harper could prove that Coleman and Sterling had conspired to fabricate evidence or manipulate witness testimony, it would provide grounds for overturning not just Terrell's conviction but potentially dozens of other cases they had worked on together. Harper's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Attorney General Antoine Johnson. The two men had been in regular contact since Denzel had agreed to take Terrell's case, but Antoine had been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries between his official duties and his personal interest in his son's freedom. "Denzel," Antoine's voice came through the speakerphone, carrying a tone of barely controlled excitement. "I've just received word from the FBI director that the Justice Department is prepared to file federal charges against Detective Coleman and several other officers in the Jefferson County Police Department. The indictments will include conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Harper exchanged a meaningful glance with Santos. Federal charges against the lead investigator in Terrell's case would provide additional ammunition for their appeal, but it also raised complex questions about timing and strategy. "What's the timeline for these indictments?" Harper asked. "The indictments will be unsealed next week," Antoine replied. "But I wanted to give you advance notice so you could coordinate your appeal strategy accordingly." The FBI has also indicated that they're prepared to make their investigation files available to defense attorneys in cases where Coleman was involved. This was the break Harper had been hoping for, with federal law enforcement validating their theories about corruption in Terrell's case. They would have credible support for their claims of prosecutorial misconduct and evidence tampering. An appellate court would be much more likely to grant a new trial when federal investigators had independently concluded that the original investigation was compromised. "Antoine," Harper said carefully, "I need to ask about the ethical implications of this cooperation. I want to make sure that nothing we're doing could be construed as inappropriate coordination between the Justice Department and Terrell's defense team." "I appreciate your concern," Antoine replied, "and I want to assure you that the FBI investigation of the Jefferson County Police Department began long before Terrell's arrest. The timing is fortunate for his case, but it's not the result of any intervention on my part. The federal charges are based on evidence that was independently developed by federal investigators." Harper nodded, satisfied that they were operating within proper ethical boundaries. The appearance of impropriety could be just as damaging as actual misconduct, and he was determined to ensure that Terrell's eventual exoneration could not be attributed to his father's political position. As the call ended, Harper turned his attention back to the FBI files, which continued to reveal evidence of corruption that extended far beyond Coleman's individual misconduct. The Jefferson County Police Department appeared to have operated as a criminal enterprise, with multiple officers participating in schemes to secure convictions through illegal means. "The scope of this corruption is staggering," Santos observed, reviewing another section of the FBI report. "They've identified at least 12 officers who were involved in evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and perjury. Some of these officers testified in Terrell's trial." Harper felt a surge of righteous anger as he contemplated the scope of the injustice that had been perpetrated against his client and countless others. Terrell Johnson was not just the victim of a wrongful conviction. He was the victim of a systematic pattern of corruption that had infected an entire law enforcement agency and judicial system. "We need to act quickly," Harper said, his voice carrying the focused intensity that emerged when he was preparing for battle. "I want to file our appeal within the week, before the media attention from the federal indictments overshadows our legal arguments. Maria, I need you to prepare a comprehensive timeline showing how the corruption affected every aspect of Terrell's case." Santos nodded, already mentally organizing the massive task ahead of her. "I'll also need to track down alternative witnesses who might have information about what really happened the night Morrison was killed. If Coleman suppressed evidence or ignored leads that pointed to other suspects, we need to find that evidence and present it to the court." As Harper's team prepared for the legal battle ahead, they understood that they were fighting for more than just one young man's freedom. They were challenging a system of corruption that had destroyed countless lives, and their success or failure would send a message about whether justice could ultimately prevail over misconduct and abuse of power. The evidence was compelling, but Harper had been practicing law long enough to know that compelling evidence did not always result in just outcomes. Appellate courts were notoriously conservative institutions, reluctant to overturn convictions unless the evidence of misconduct was overwhelming and undeniable. Even with FBI files documenting extensive corruption, the road to Terrell's exoneration would be long and difficult. But as Harper looked at the photograph of Terrell Johnson that sat on his desk, seeing the face of a 17-year-old boy who had been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect him, he felt the familiar fire of determination that had driven him throughout his career. This case represented everything he had spent his professional life fighting against: prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and a criminal justice system that too often prioritized convictions over truth. The stakes could not be higher. A young man's life hung in the balance, but beyond that, the case would send a message about whether the American criminal justice system could police itself and correct its own mistakes. Harper understood that they were not just fighting for Terrell Johnson, they were fighting for the principle that justice should be blind to race, class, and political connections. As evening fell over Atlanta, Harper's team continued their work, knowing that somewhere in a prison cell 2 states away, a 17-year-old boy was counting on them to restore his freedom and his future. The evidence was compelling, the moral case was clear, but the legal battle ahead would test every skill and resource they possessed. Justice delayed was justice denied, and they had already lost too much time to corruption and incompetence. The fight for Terrell Johnson's freedom was about to enter its most crucial phase, and Harper was determined to ensure that this time the system would work as it was intended to work, in service of truth, justice, and the protection of the innocent. The story broke on a Tuesday morning when investigative journalist Rachel Morrison of the Atlanta Constitution published a front-page exposé titled "The Son of Justice: How the Attorney General's Teenager Became a Life Prisoner." The article, which had taken Morrison 3 weeks to research and write, laid out in devastating detail the circumstances surrounding Terrell Johnson's conviction, the apparent corruption within the Jefferson County Police Department, and the broader implications of a case that seemed to embody everything wrong with America's criminal justice system. Morrison was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose investigative work had exposed corruption in state governments across the South. She was known for her meticulous research, her ability to find sources who would speak on sensitive topics, and her skill at presenting complex legal issues in ways that ordinary citizens could understand and relate to. When she first heard about Terrell's case through contacts in the legal community, she recognized immediately that it had all the elements of a major national story. The article opened with a powerful narrative that drew readers into the human drama of the case. 17-year-old Terrell Johnson had dreams of becoming an engineer, of using mathematics and science to build bridges and skyscrapers that would stand for generations. Today, those dreams lie buried beneath the concrete walls of the Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, where Johnson is serving a sentence of life without parole for a murder that mounting evidence suggests he did not commit. Morrison's investigation had uncovered details that even Denzel Harper's team had not yet discovered. She had tracked down former Jefferson County police officers who spoke anonymously about a culture of corruption within the department, including routine practices of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. She had obtained internal emails between Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling and Detective Coleman that suggested coordination beyond what was legally appropriate. Most dramatically, Morrison had located Keenan Williams, one of the key witnesses against Terrell, living under an assumed name in a neighboring state. In an exclusive interview, Williams recanted his trial testimony, admitting that he had been threatened by police and coerced into identifying Terrell as one of the perpetrators. "They told me that if I didn't cooperate, they would arrest me for outstanding warrants," Williams told Morrison during a recorded interview. "Detective Coleman showed me a photograph of Terrell and told me that this was the guy they knew was involved, and all I had to do was confirm it. I was scared, man. I had a record, and I knew they could make my life hell if I didn't do what they wanted." The revelation of Williams' recantation was explosive. It provided concrete evidence of the witness tampering that Harper's team had suspected but been unable to prove. Combined with the FBI investigation files and the pattern of corruption Morrison had documented, it painted a picture of a criminal justice system that had completely failed in its most basic responsibility. Determining the Truth. The article also explored the broader context of Terrell's case within the ongoing national conversation about criminal justice reform. Morrison interviewed civil rights advocates, legal scholars, and other families affected by wrongful convictions, creating a narrative that positioned Terrell's story as emblematic of systemic problems that affected thousands of Americans, particularly young men of color. Within hours of the article's publication, the story was picked up by major news outlets across the country. Cable news networks ran segments analyzing the case, legal experts appeared on talk shows to discuss the implications, and social media buzzed with outrage over what appeared to be a grievous miscarriage of justice. The hashtag #FreeTerrell began trending nationally as supporters shared the article and demanded action. The media attention created both opportunities and challenges for Terrell's legal team. On one hand, public pressure could potentially influence appellate judges to take a more careful look at the case and consider the mounting evidence of misconduct. On the other hand, excessive media coverage could be seen as an attempt to try the case in the court of public opinion rather than through proper legal channels. Denzel Harper found himself fielding dozens of interview requests from reporters seeking to understand the legal strategy for overturning Terrell's conviction. He was careful to maintain his focus on the legal merits of the case while acknowledging the broader social justice implications of the story. This case is about more than one young man, though Terrell Johnson's freedom is our immediate concern, Harper told CNN during a live interview. This case is about whether our criminal justice system can acknowledge and correct its own mistakes, whether it can hold itself accountable when prosecutors and police officers abuse their power and destroy innocent lives. The interview was watched by millions of viewers, many of whom were learning about Terrell's case for the first time. Harper's articulate presentation of the evidence, combined with his obvious passion for justice, helped build public support for Terrell's cause, while maintaining the dignity and seriousness that such a grave matter demanded. At the Jefferson County Prosecutor's Office, Rebecca Sterling found herself under intense scrutiny for the first time in her career. Local reporters staked out the courthouse, seeking comments about the allegations of misconduct and the growing evidence that her prosecution of Terrell Johnson had been built on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. Sterling's initial response was defiant. In a hastily arranged press conference, she defended her handling of the case and dismissed the media coverage as an attempt to undermine law and order through sensationalism and political pressure. The jury heard all the evidence in this case and reached their verdict based on facts, not on speculation or political considerations, Sterling declared, her voice carrying the confidence that had made her a formidable prosecutor for over a decade. Terrell Johnson was convicted by a jury of his peers after a fair trial in which he was represented by counsel. The attempts to retry this case in the media are inappropriate and potentially harmful to the cause of justice. But Sterling's confident facade began to crack as more details emerged about Detective Coleman's corruption and the FBI investigation into the police department. When federal indictments were unsealed the following week, charging Coleman and 3 other officers with conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations, Sterling's position became increasingly untenable. The federal charges provided official validation of the corruption allegations that had been swirling around the case for months. More damaging still, the indictment specifically mentioned the Morrison murder investigation as one of the cases where evidence had been fabricated and witnesses had been coerced. This gave credibility to defense claims that had previously been dismissed as desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Judge Harrison, who had sentenced Terrell to life without parole, also found himself under scrutiny as the case gained national attention. Legal scholars questioned his decision to impose the harshest possible sentence on a 17-year-old defendant based on what now appeared to be fabricated evidence. Civil rights organizations called for judicial reform and better oversight of sentencing decisions, particularly in cases involving young defendants of color. The judge's office issued a brief statement noting that his sentencing decision had been based on the jury's verdict and the evidence presented at trial, but declining further comment while the case remained under appeal. However, sources close to Harrison indicated that he was privately troubled by the revelations about police corruption and was closely following the developments in the case. For Antoine Johnson, the media attention created a complex set of challenges. As Attorney General, he was committed to supporting law enforcement and maintaining public confidence in the criminal justice system. But as a father, he was desperate to see his son freed from what increasingly appeared to be a wrongful conviction based on fabricated evidence. Antoine's position became even more difficult when political opponents began to question whether he could objectively oversee federal law enforcement while his own son was challenging a state conviction. Some called for him to recuse himself from any federal involvement in criminal justice issues, while others suggested that his continued service as Attorney General represented a conflict of interest that undermined the integrity of the Justice Department. In response to these criticisms, Antoine held his own press conference, addressing the nation from the Justice Department's main briefing room. He stood behind the podium with the American flag and the Department of Justice seal visible behind him, symbols of the principles and institutions he had sworn to serve. I want to address directly the questions that have been raised about my ability to serve as Attorney General while my son appeals his conviction in state court, Antoine began, his voice carrying the gravity and authority that had made him one of the nation's most respected prosecutors. Let me be absolutely clear. I believe in my son's innocence. But I also believe in the rule of law and the importance of allowing our legal system to function without political interference. He continued, outlining the steps he had taken to ensure that federal investigations into the Jefferson County Police Department had proceeded independently of any personal considerations. He emphasized that the FBI investigation had begun before Terrell's arrest and was based on evidence developed through routine federal oversight of local law enforcement agencies. The federal charges that were filed against Detective Coleman and his colleagues were based on evidence gathered through proper legal channels by federal agents who were unaware of any connection to my family, Antoine stated firmly. Justice is not served when prosecutors or police officers abuse their power to secure convictions through illegal means, regardless of who the defendant might be. The press conference was widely viewed as a successful defense of Antoine's integrity and commitment to impartial justice. Editorial writers and legal commentators generally praised his handling of a difficult situation, noting that he had managed to support his son while maintaining appropriate boundaries between his personal interests and his official duties. However, the political pressure on Antoine continued to mount as Terrell's case gained more national attention. Congressional Republicans called for hearings into the Justice Department's handling of federal criminal justice issues, while progressive Democrats criticized what they saw as systemic racism within law enforcement agencies that the department was supposed to oversee. The media storm also had profound effects on the Johnson family. Jasmine found herself thrust into the national spotlight, with reporters constantly seeking interviews about her son's case and her ex-husband's position as Attorney General. The attention was overwhelming for a woman who had spent her life working quietly to support her family and had never sought public recognition. Jasmine's response to the media attention was both dignified and powerful. In carefully planned interviews with sympathetic journalists, she presented herself as a mother whose primary concern was seeing justice done for her son. She spoke eloquently about Terrell's character, his academic achievements, and his dreams for the future that had been cut short by his wrongful conviction. Terrell is not just a case number or a political issue, Jasmine said during an interview with PBS NewsHour. He's a 17-year-old boy who has never been in trouble with the law, who was working hard in school and dreaming of college, who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The system failed him completely, and now we're fighting to get him back the life that was taken from him, Jasmine's interviews were particularly effective because she came across as authentic and relatable, a mother whose love for her son transcended political considerations or legal technicalities. Her emotional appeals for justice resonated with parents across the country who could imagine their own children caught in a similar nightmare. Meanwhile, Terrell's sister Destiny faced her own challenges as news of the case spread to her college campus. Fellow students and faculty members suddenly knew her as the sister of that kid who got life in prison, and she struggled with the stigma and attention that came with her family's notoriety. But Destiny also became an advocate for her brother, using her position as a pre-med student to speak about the broader social justice issues highlighted by his case. She organized campus events, gave interviews to student newspapers, and used social media to build support for criminal justice reform. Her articulate advocacy helped demonstrate that Terrell came from a family of accomplished, law-abiding citizens who were committed to making positive contributions to society. The media coverage also brought unexpected support from celebrities, politicians, and advocacy organizations who saw Terrell's case as representative of broader problems within the criminal justice system. Civil rights leaders organized rallies and petitions, while legal reform organizations used the case to highlight the need for better oversight of prosecutors and police officers. As the story continued to dominate news cycles, it became clear that Terrell Johnson had become more than just a wrongfully convicted teenager. He had become a symbol of the fight for justice and equality in America. The pressure was building for courts to take a serious look at his case, but that pressure also created expectations that might be difficult to meet through the slow, deliberate process of appellate litigation. The media storm surrounding Terrell's case represented both the best and worst aspects of American democracy. At its best, it demonstrated the power of a free press to expose corruption and injustice, the ability of public opinion to demand accountability, and the potential for individual stories to illuminate broader social problems. At its worst, it risked turning a serious legal matter into a political circus where emotion and spectacle might overshadow careful legal analysis and due process. As Denzel Harper prepared for the next phase of Terrell's legal battle, he understood that the media attention was a double-edged sword that could either help or hurt their cause. The challenge would be to harness the public support for justice while ensuring that the appellate courts focused on the legal merits of the case rather than the political implications of their decision. The Georgia State Court of Appeals building stood majestically on Capitol Square in Atlanta, its neoclassical columns and marble facade projecting the dignity and permanence that were meant to inspire confidence in the state's highest judicial authority. Inside the building's ornate courtroom, 3 appellate judges sat behind an elevated bench, their black robes lending them an air of scholarly authority as they prepared to hear arguments that could determine whether Terrell Johnson would spend the rest of his life in prison or walk free to reclaim his stolen future. Chief Judge Elizabeth Patterson, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, presided over the 3-judge panel. She had served on the appellate court for 12 years and had developed a reputation for careful legal analysis and a willingness to overturn lower court decisions when the evidence warranted such action. To her right sat Judge Robert Hayes, a conservative jurist known for his reluctance to second-guess jury verdicts, and to her left sat Judge David Kim, a former defense attorney whose experience representing criminal defendants had given him particular insight into the challenges facing those accused of crimes. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and legal observers who understood that they were witnessing a case that could have profound implications for criminal justice reform throughout the state. In the front row of the gallery sat Jasmine Johnson, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she prepared to watch lawyers argue for her son's freedom. Beside her sat several community leaders and civil rights advocates who had rallied to Terrell's cause, their presence serving as a reminder of the broader social justice issues at stake in the case. At the appellant's table, Denzel Harper reviewed his notes one final time, his mind focused on the legal arguments he would present to convince the judges that Terrell's conviction should be overturned. Harper had spent months preparing for this moment, crafting legal briefs that methodically dismantled every aspect of the prosecution's case while presenting compelling evidence of the corruption and misconduct that had led to Terrell's wrongful conviction. The case file before Harper contained hundreds of pages of evidence that told a story of systemic failure at every level of the criminal justice system. There were FBI reports documenting Detective Coleman's pattern of evidence tampering, sworn affidavits from witnesses who had recanted their testimony, expert analysis of crime scene evidence that had been misinterpreted or ignored, and communications between prosecutor and police that suggested coordination beyond what was legally appropriate. Across the courtroom, Attorney General Rebecca Sterling sat at the appellee's table, accompanied by two assistant attorneys general who had been assigned to defend the conviction on behalf of the state. Sterling's position had become increasingly difficult as evidence of corruption in Terrell's case had mounted, but she remained committed to defending the jury's verdict and maintaining public confidence in the criminal justice system. Sterling's strategy was to argue that even if there had been misconduct by individual actors, the evidence against Terrell remained compelling enough to support his conviction. She would contend that the appellate court should not overturn a jury verdict based on speculation and allegations, but should defer to the original fact-finders who had heard all the evidence and reached their conclusion based on the totality of the case. Chief Judge Patterson called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. We are here today to consider the appeal of Terrell Johnson from his conviction for first-degree murder in Jefferson County Superior Court. Mr. Harper, you may begin your arguments for the appellant. Harper rose slowly, his imposing presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. He approached the lectern with the confidence of someone who had presented dozens of similar arguments, but also with the passion of someone who believed deeply in the justice of his cause. "Thank you, Chief Judge Patterson," Harper began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's acoustic system. "Your Honors, this case represents a fundamental breakdown of the criminal justice system at every level. What we have here is not a legitimate conviction based on credible evidence, but a wrongful conviction obtained through prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and the systematic suppression of exculpatory evidence." Harper's opening statement was designed to frame the case in the starkest possible terms, to convince the judges that they were not simply reviewing a routine criminal conviction, but confronting a miscarriage of justice that demanded their immediate intervention. The evidence before this court demonstrates that Detective Coleman, the lead investigator in this case, engaged in a pattern of witness intimidation and evidence fabrication that has since resulted in federal criminal charges, Harper continued. Key witnesses have recanted their testimony, admitting that they were coerced by police into falsely identifying my client. Physical evidence that could have exonerated Terrell Johnson was either ignored or suppressed by investigators who were more interested in securing a conviction than finding the truth. Judge Hayes interrupted Harper's presentation with a pointed question that went to the heart of the state's defense strategy. "Mr. Harper, even assuming there was misconduct by individual officers, doesn't the defendant bear the burden of showing that this misconduct actually affected the outcome of the trial? The jury still heard testimony from multiple witnesses who identified your client as being present at the crime scene." Harper had anticipated this question and was prepared with a comprehensive response. "Your Honor, that testimony has been completely discredited by subsequent revelations. Keenan Williams, who was the prosecution's star witness, has now admitted under oath that he never saw my client at the crime scene and that his identification was the result of police coercion. Marcus Thompson, the other key witness, has recanted his testimony and revealed that Detective Coleman threatened him with arrest if he didn't cooperate with the prosecution's theory of the case." The judge nodded, making notes as Harper continued his argument. The recanted testimony was indeed powerful evidence that the original conviction had been based on fabricated evidence, but the appellate court would need to be convinced that the misconduct was so pervasive that no reasonable jury could have convicted Terrell based on legitimate evidence alone. Harper spent the next 20 minutes methodically presenting evidence of the corruption that had infected every aspect of Terrell's case. He showed how Detective Coleman had met with witnesses outside of official channels, how physical evidence had been mishandled or ignored, and how the prosecution had failed to disclose exculpatory evidence that could have changed the outcome of the trial. Most troubling of all, Harper said as he approached the climax of his argument, is the evidence of coordination between Detective Coleman and Prosecutor Sterling that went far beyond what was legally appropriate. Internal communications show that Sterling was receiving regular briefings about the investigation's progress and was actively involved in deciding which evidence to pursue and which leads to ignore. This allegation drew a sharp response from Judge Kim, who had extensive experience in criminal defense and understood the ethical boundaries that were supposed to govern prosecutor-police relationships. Mr. Harper, are you alleging that the prosecutor in this case was actively involved in the fabrication of evidence? I am alleging that the prosecutor knew or should have known that key evidence in this case was fabricated, and that her failure to investigate obvious red flags constituted prosecutorial misconduct that violated my client's constitutional rights, Harper replied. When a prosecutor receives information suggesting that witnesses are being coerced or that evidence is being fabricated, she has an ethical and legal obligation to investigate those concerns rather than proceed with a prosecution based on tainted evidence. The courtroom was silent as Harper's words sank in. The allegation of prosecutorial misconduct was extremely serious, potentially affecting not just Terrell's case, but Sterling's entire career and the validity of other convictions she had secured through similar methods. Harper concluded his argument with a passionate plea that connected Terrell's individual case to broader principles of justice and fairness. Your Honors, Terrell Johnson was 17 years old when he was convicted based on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. He has already spent months in prison for a crime he did not commit, months during which his dreams of college and career have been put on indefinite hold. But this case is about more than one young man's future. This case is about whether our criminal justice system can acknowledge and correct its own mistakes, whether it can hold prosecutors and police officers accountable when they abuse their power to secure wrongful convictions. As Harper returned to his seat, Chief Judge Patterson turned to Attorney General Sterling, who rose to present the state's defense of Terrell's conviction. Sterling's position had become increasingly difficult as evidence of corruption had mounted, but she remained committed to defending the jury's verdict and arguing that the appellate court should not second-guess the fact-finders who had originally heard the case. Your Honors, Sterling began, her voice carrying the confidence that had made her a successful prosecutor for over a decade. While the defense has made serious allegations about misconduct in this case, we must not lose sight of the fundamental fact that Terrell Johnson was convicted by a jury of his peers after a fair trial in which he was represented by counsel. The defendant's guilt was established beyond a reasonable doubt based on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and the circumstances surrounding the crime. Sterling's strategy was to minimize the significance of the recanted testimony while emphasizing other evidence that she claimed still supported Terrell's conviction. She argued that even if some witnesses had been coerced, there remained sufficient evidence to support the jury's verdict. The defense would have this court believe that an entire investigation was fabricated from beginning to end, Sterling continued, but that simply does not match the evidence presented at trial. While Detective Coleman may have engaged in misconduct in other cases, that does not automatically invalidate every aspect of the investigation into Kevin Morrison's murder. Judge Patterson interrupted Sterling's argument with a question that went to the heart of the case. Ms. Sterling, how do you respond to the evidence that key witnesses have recanted their testimony and admitted they were coerced by police into making false identifications? Sterling had prepared for this question, but her response revealed the weakness of her position. Your Honor, Recanted testimony is notoriously unreliable, particularly when it comes months or years after the original trial. These witnesses may have been influenced by media coverage or pressure from defense investigators. The jury heard their original testimony under oath and was in the best position to assess their credibility. This response drew skeptical looks from all three judges, who understood that recanted testimony was particularly powerful when it was supported by independent evidence of police misconduct. The FBI investigation had provided exactly that kind of independent corroboration, making the recantations much more credible than they would have been in isolation. Judge Kim pressed Sterling on another crucial point. "Ms. Sterling, what is your response to the FBI findings that Detective Coleman engaged in systematic evidence tampering and witness intimidation? How can the court have confidence in a conviction that was obtained through the work of an investigator who has since been charged with federal crimes?" Sterling's response revealed her growing desperation as the weight of evidence against her position became overwhelming. "Your Honor, the federal charges against Detective Coleman are based on his conduct in other cases, not specifically on his work in the Morrison murder investigation. While these charges are concerning, they do not automatically invalidate every case Coleman worked on throughout his career." But even as Sterling made this argument, she knew that it was unlikely to persuade judges who were clearly troubled by the scope of corruption that had been revealed in Terrell's case. The combination of recanted testimony, federal corruption charges, and evidence of prosecutorial misconduct created a compelling case for overturning the conviction. Sterling spent the remainder of her time arguing that the appellate court should defer to the jury's original verdict and avoid setting a precedent that would allow defendants to challenge convictions based on allegations of misconduct that arose after their trials. She contended that overturning Terrell's conviction would undermine public confidence in the criminal justice system and encourage frivolous appeals from other convicted defendants. As Sterling concluded her argument and returned to her seat, the three judges retired to deliberate on their decision. The courtroom remained silent as spectators and participants alike understood that they had just witnessed legal arguments that would determine not only Terrell Johnson's fate but also send a message about the appellate court's willingness to confront corruption and misconduct within the criminal justice system. In the prison cell where he had spent the past 6 months, Terrell waited anxiously for word about the appellate court's decision. He had not been permitted to attend the hearing, but his mother had promised to call as soon as the judges announced their ruling. The waiting was almost unbearable, knowing that his entire future hung in the balance while three judges considered whether the evidence of his innocence was compelling enough to overturn his conviction. As the afternoon wore on, legal observers and journalists debated the likely outcome of the appeal. The evidence of corruption and misconduct appeared overwhelming, but appellate courts were notoriously conservative institutions that were reluctant to overturn jury verdicts, even in cases where misconduct had been proven. The decision, when it finally came, would represent a test of the appellate system's commitment to justice and its willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption within the criminal justice system. For Terrell Johnson, for his family, and for the thousands of other wrongfully convicted defendants across the country, the stakes could not have been higher. 3 weeks after oral arguments, the Georgia State Court of Appeals released its decision in the case of Johnson v. State of Georgia. The 47-page ruling, authored by Chief Judge Patterson and joined by Judges Hayes and Kim, represented a comprehensive repudiation of the conviction that had sent 17-year-old Terrell Johnson to prison for life. The decision would be remembered as a landmark ruling in the fight against prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption, but for the Johnson family it represented something much simpler and more profound: the return of hope. The ruling began with a stark assessment of the systematic failures that had led to Terrell's wrongful conviction. This case presents a disturbing example of how corruption within law enforcement can poison every aspect of a criminal prosecution, from the initial investigation through trial and sentencing. The evidence before this court demonstrates that the defendant's conviction was obtained through a combination of fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and prosecutorial misconduct that violated his fundamental constitutional rights. In his cell at Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, Terrell was summoned to meet with Warden Phillips, a gruff but fair-minded man who had spent 30 years working in corrections. Phillips had seen thousands of inmates come and go during his career, but he had never had to deliver news quite like what he was about to share with the young man sitting across from his desk. "Johnson," the warden began, his voice carrying an unusual tone of solemnity mixed with something that might have been relief. "I've just received word from the Court of Appeals regarding your case. Your conviction has been overturned, and you're going to be released pending a decision by the prosecutor's office about whether to retry you." For a moment, Terrell couldn't process what he was hearing. After 6 months of living with the crushing certainty that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the concept of freedom seemed almost abstract, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. His hands began to shake as the reality of the warden's words slowly penetrated the psychological armor he had built to protect himself from hope. "Are you saying I'm going home?" Terrell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Phillips replied, and for the first time since Terrell had known him, the warden smiled. "Your attorney is on his way here now to handle the paperwork for your release. You should be walking out of here this afternoon." In Atlanta, Denzel Harper's office erupted in celebration as the news of the appellate court's decision spread throughout the firm. Harper himself remained characteristically focused, already turning his attention to the next phase of Terrell's legal journey. While the overturned conviction was a tremendous victory, the threat of retrial meant that their work was far from finished. Harper immediately placed a call to Attorney General Antoine Johnson, who was in a meeting with congressional leadership when his secretary interrupted to deliver the news. Antoine excused himself from the meeting and took the call in his private office, his hands trembling slightly as he answered the phone. "Denzel," Antoine said, his voice thick with emotion, "please tell me this is real." "It's real, Antoine," Harper replied, his own voice reflecting the satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. "The court didn't just overturn the conviction, they eviscerated it. Judge Patterson's opinion is a complete condemnation of the prosecution's conduct and the police investigation. She found that Terrell's constitutional rights were violated at every stage of the process." Antoine closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, feeling as though an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For months he had maintained his composure in public while privately agonizing over his son's fate. Now, for the first time since that devastating phone call from the courthouse, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually prevail. "What happens next?" Antoine asked, his legal training reasserting itself even in the midst of his relief. "The ball is in Rebecca Sterling's court now," Harper explained. "She has 30 days to decide whether to retry Terrell or dismiss the charges entirely. Given the evidence of corruption and the fact that her key witnesses have recanted, I can't imagine she'll want to put this case in front of another jury." Meanwhile, in Jefferson County, Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling was meeting with her senior staff to discuss the appellate court's devastating ruling. The decision had not only overturned Terrell's conviction, but it also raised serious questions about Sterling's own conduct during the prosecution. The court had stopped just short of finding that she had knowingly used fabricated evidence, but the implications were clear enough to threaten her career and reputation. "We need to make a decision about retrial within 30 days, Sterling said to her assembled staff, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "What are our options?" Assistant District Attorney James Crawford, Sterling's most trusted deputy, had spent the morning reviewing the appellate court's decision and considering their limited options. "Rebecca, I have to be honest with you. This decision destroys our case. Every key piece of evidence has been discredited, our main witnesses have recanted, and the court has found that our investigation was fundamentally flawed. If we retry this case, we're going to lose, and we're going to look vindictive in the process. Sterling knew that Crawford was right, but the political implications of dismissing charges against such a high-profile defendant were staggering. She had built her career on securing convictions and maintaining law and order in Jefferson County. Admitting that she had prosecuted an innocent teenager for murder would undermine everything she had worked to accomplish. "What about public safety?" Sterling asked, grasping for any argument that might justify continuing the prosecution. "The real killer is still out there. If we dismiss charges against Johnson, doesn't that send a message that we're giving up on justice for Kevin Morrison?" Crawford's response was blunt and unforgiving. "Rebecca, the reason the real killer is still out there is because Coleman and his team were so focused on railroading Johnson that they never conducted a proper investigation. We're not giving up on justice. We're acknowledging that we got it wrong the first time." The meeting continued for another hour, but the conclusion was inevitable. With the appellate court having found that the original prosecution was based on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony, there was simply no viable case to present to a new jury. Sterling would have to make the most difficult decision of her career, dismissing charges against Terrell Johnson and effectively admitting that her office had wrongfully convicted an innocent teenager. At Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, Terrell was gathering his few possessions as correctional officers prepared the paperwork for his release. His cellmate Curtis watched with a mixture of joy and envy as the young man who had arrived 6 months earlier as a frightened teenager prepared to leave as someone who had survived the system's worst failures and emerged with his dignity intact. "Remember what I told you when you first got here," Curtis said, as Terrell folded his letters from home and placed them in a plastic bag. "The moment you walk out of here, you start fighting for everyone who's still inside. Your freedom isn't just about you. It's about proving that the system can be forced to acknowledge its mistakes." Terrell nodded, understanding that his release would make him a symbol in the fight against wrongful convictions and criminal justice reform. He had learned much during his 6 months in prison, not just about survival, but about the systemic problems that had put him there in the first place. His experience had opened his eyes to injustices that extended far beyond his own case. The steel door of his cell opened one final time, and Terrell walked out into the corridor that had defined the boundaries of his world for so many months. Each step toward the prison's exit felt surreal, as if he was walking through a dream that might evaporate at any moment. The sounds of the prison, which had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, gradually faded behind him as he approached the final checkpoint. Officer Graham, who had been kind to Terrell throughout his incarceration, was waiting at the processing desk with the paperwork for his release. The veteran corrections officer had seen many inmates leave these walls over the years, but few departures had affected him as much as watching this young man walk free after what everyone now understood had been a terrible miscarriage of justice. "You take care of yourself out there, son," Graham said as he handed Terrell his release papers, "and don't let anybody convince you that what happened to you was acceptable. You fight to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Outside the prison walls, a small crowd had gathered, despite efforts to keep Terrell's release time confidential. Jasmine Johnson stood at the front of the group, tears streaming down her face as she waited to embrace the son she had feared she might never hold again. Beside her stood Antoine, who had taken leave from his duties as Attorney General to be present for this moment. Behind them, members of the community who had supported Terrell throughout his ordeal waited with signs calling for criminal justice reform. When Terrell emerged from the prison entrance, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but all he could see was his mother's face, radiant with joy and relief after months of anguish. He ran to her embrace, both of them sobbing as they held each other for the first time since that devastating day. in the courthouse when his life had been turned upside down. "I knew you'd come home," Jasmine whispered through her tears. "I never stopped believing you'd come home." Antoine approached his son cautiously, uncertain how their relationship might have been affected by the trauma of the past 6 months. But Terrell reached out to embrace his father, understanding that Antoine had risked everything to help secure his freedom while maintaining his ethical obligations as Attorney General. "Thank you, Dad," Terrell said simply. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Denzel Harper stood nearby, watching the family reunion with satisfaction, but also with the knowledge that their legal battle might not be over. While the appellate court had overturned Terrell's conviction, the possibility of retrial meant that the young man's freedom remained tenuous until the prosecutor made a final decision about the case. "We still have work to do," Harper told the gathered reporters, his voice carrying both celebration and caution. "While we're thrilled that Terrell is free today, we won't rest until the charges against him are completely dismissed and the real perpetrator of this crime is brought to justice." The media attention surrounding Terrell's release was intense, with news crews from across the country covering the story of the Attorney General's son who had been freed after a wrongful conviction. But Harper and the Johnson family had agreed to limit media appearances until the legal situation was completely resolved. As the crowd began to disperse, the Johnson family climbed into Antoine's car for the drive home to Washington, where Terrell would begin the difficult process of rebuilding his life after 6 months in prison. The physical freedom was immediate and overwhelming, but the psychological effects of his incarceration would take much longer to heal. During the drive, Terrell stared out the window at a world that seemed both familiar and strange after his months of confinement. The simple act of traveling freely, of seeing trees and buildings and people going about their daily lives, felt almost miraculous after the controlled environment of prison. But he also found himself scanning the landscape with the hypervigilance he had developed behind bars, a survival instinct that would be difficult to shake. "It's going to take time to adjust," Antoine said gently, recognizing the signs of institutional conditioning in his son's behavior. "Don't expect to feel normal right away. What you've been through would affect anyone." Terrell nodded, grateful for his father's understanding. The months in prison had changed him in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. He had witnessed injustices that most people could hardly imagine, had formed friendships with men whose stories of wrongful conviction had opened his eyes to the scope of the problems within the criminal justice system. 3 days after Terrell's release, Rebecca Sterling held a press conference in Jefferson County to announce her decision regarding retrial. Standing behind a podium in the courthouse where Terrell had been sentenced to life in prison, Sterling delivered the words that would finally end his legal nightmare. "After careful consideration of the Court of Appeals decision and consultation with my staff," Sterling announced, her voice lacking its usual confidence, "the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office has decided not to retry Terrell Johnson on charges related to the death of Kevin Morrison. The charges against Mr. Johnson are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community and provided vindication for everyone who had fought to prove Terrell's innocence. But Sterling's statement also included an acknowledgement that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "I want to express my regret to Mr. Johnson and his family for the ordeal they have endured," Sterling continued, her voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "While we acted in good faith based on the evidence available at the time, it is now clear that serious errors were made in the investigation and prosecution of this case. We are committed to conducting a thorough review of our procedures to ensure that similar mistakes do not occur in the future." The dismissal of charges meant that Terrell was truly free, no longer subject to the threat of retrial or the uncertainty that had clouded his release. But more importantly, it represented an official acknowledgement by the state that he had been wrongfully convicted, opening the door for potential compensation and civil litigation against the officials whose misconduct had destroyed his life. In Washington, the Johnson family gathered around their television to watch Sterling's press conference. When the prosecutor announced the dismissal of charges, Jasmine broke down in tears of relief, while Antoine and Terrell embraced. The nightmare that had consumed their lives for nearly a year was finally over. But even as they celebrated this long-awaited victory, the Johnson family understood that their fight for justice was far from complete. The corrupt officials who had fabricated evidence and coerced testimony would face federal charges, but the systemic problems that had enabled Terrell's wrongful conviction remained largely unchanged. Over the following weeks, Terrell began the difficult process of readjusting to life outside prison. Simple activities like going to the grocery store or riding in a car without restraints felt overwhelming after months of highly regimented institutional life. He experienced panic attacks, nightmares, and periods of depression as he struggled to process the trauma of his experience. With the help of therapists who specialized in treating wrongfully convicted individuals, Terrell slowly began to heal from the psychological wounds inflicted by his ordeal. He learned coping strategies for managing the hypervigilance and anxiety that had become second nature during his incarceration, and he began to envision a future that extended beyond the walls that had once confined him. Most importantly, Terrell discovered that his experience had given him a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. He began speaking to groups about criminal justice reform, sharing his story with audiences who needed to understand the human cost of prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. His articulate testimony before congressional committees and civil rights organizations helped build momentum for legislative reforms that would provide better protection for defendants and accountability for prosecutors who abuse their power. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," Terrell would tell these audiences, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand. "The system failed me at every level, from the police investigation through trial and sentencing. But my story also shows that the system can be forced to correct its mistakes when people of good conscience refuse to accept injustice." Denzel Harper watched with pride as his former client transformed from a frightened teenager into an articulate advocate for criminal justice reform. Terrell's ability to speak from personal experience about the failures of the system gave him a credibility that legal experts and policy analysts could never match. As the first anniversary of Terrell's arrest approached, Harper reflected on the case that had consumed so much of his time and energy over the past year. The victory had been complete and satisfying, but it had also highlighted the broader problems within a system that too often prioritized convictions over truth. Terrell's case was not unique, Harper told a gathering of defense attorneys at their annual conference. "Every day, innocent people are convicted based on fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and prosecutorial misconduct. Terrell was lucky because his father had the resources and connections to mount an effective defense. But what about all the other innocent people who don't have those advantages? What about the people who are still sitting in prison cells, serving sentences for crimes they didn't commit?" The questions Harper raised were uncomfortable, but necessary. Terrell's exoneration had brought attention to the problems of wrongful conviction and prosecutorial misconduct, but it had also revealed the extent to which justice in America often depended on wealth, connections, and the ability to navigate a complex legal system. For Antoine Johnson, His son's ordeal had provided painful insights into the limitations of a criminal justice system he had spent his career serving. As Attorney General, he had the power to investigate prosecutorial misconduct and hold corrupt officials accountable. But he had also learned that systemic change required more than individual prosecutions. We need to fundamentally rethink how we approach criminal justice in this country, Antoine told a gathering of state attorneys general several months after Terrell's exoneration. We need better training for prosecutors, stronger oversight of police investigations, and meaningful consequences for officials who abuse their power. Most importantly, we need to remember that our ultimate obligation is to seek truth and justice, not just to secure convictions. The reforms Antoine advocated were not popular with all law enforcement officials, but his personal experience with the system's failures gave his arguments a moral authority that was difficult to dispute. His willingness to use his position to push for accountability and reform helped establish new standards for prosecutorial conduct and police investigation procedures. 2 years after Terrell Johnson walked free from Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, the ripple effects of his wrongful conviction continued to reshape the landscape of criminal justice reform throughout Georgia and beyond. The case had become a rallying point for advocates seeking to address systemic problems within prosecutorial offices and police departments, while Terrell himself had emerged as one of the most compelling voices in the national conversation about wrongful convictions. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was packed on the morning when Detective Coleman and 3 of his fellow officers faced sentencing for their roles in the corruption scandal that had destroyed Terrell's life and countless others. Judge Sandra Mitchell, a no-nonsense jurist known for her tough sentences in public corruption cases, presided over the proceedings with the gravity that such cases deserved. Coleman, once a confident and arrogant figure who had used his badge to intimidate witnesses and fabricate evidence, sat at the defendant's table looking like a broken man. His career in law enforcement was over, his pension had been forfeited, and he now faced the prospect of spending the next decade in federal prison. The investigation had revealed that his misconduct extended far beyond Terrell's case, affecting dozens of prosecutions and potentially invalidating hundreds of convictions. Detective Coleman, Judge Mitchell said as she prepared to deliver his sentence, "You have not only betrayed the oath you took to serve and protect the community, but you have also undermined public confidence in law enforcement and destroyed the lives of innocent people through your criminal conduct. The evidence shows that your actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of corruption that lasted for years." Coleman's attorney had pleaded for leniency, arguing that his client was a veteran officer who had made mistakes under pressure to solve cases and reduce crime statistics. But the judge was unmoved by these arguments, understanding that public corruption demanded severe punishment to restore faith in the criminal justice system. "You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison to be followed by 3 years of supervised release," Judge Mitchell announced. "I hope that your sentence will serve as a warning to other law enforcement officers who might be tempted to abuse their power and violate the constitutional rights of the citizens they are sworn to protect." The sentences for Coleman's co-conspirators ranged from 8 to 10 years, reflecting their varying degrees of involvement in the corruption scheme. Each sentence was accompanied by Judge Mitchell's sharp words about the special responsibility that comes with wearing a badge and carrying a gun in service of the public. Terrell sat in the gallery watching the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it could not restore the months of his life that had been stolen or completely heal the psychological wounds inflicted by his ordeal. Still, Seeing the corrupt officers finally held accountable provided a measure of closure that had been missing from his journey toward healing. After the sentencing hearing, Terrell spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, his words carrying the weight of hard-won experience and moral authority that had made him such an effective advocate for criminal justice reform. "Today's sentences represent a victory for justice," Terrell said, his voice steady and confident despite the emotional weight of the moment. "But we cannot let the punishment of these corrupt officers distract us from the systemic problems that enabled their misconduct in the first place. There are still innocent people sitting in prison cells because of fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. There are still prosecutors who care more about their conviction rates than about seeking truth. Our work is far from over." Rebecca Sterling had resigned her position as Jefferson County District Attorney 6 months after Terrell's exoneration, unable to survive the political fallout from her role in prosecuting an innocent teenager. Her successor, a reform-minded prosecutor named David Richardson, had instituted new policies requiring enhanced oversight of police investigations and mandatory training for prosecutors on recognizing and addressing potential misconduct. Richardson had also established a conviction integrity unit to review questionable cases from Sterling's tenure, leading to the exoneration of 3 additional defendants whose convictions had been tainted by Coleman's misconduct. The unit's work was far from complete, with dozens of cases still under review and the possibility that more innocent people would be freed as the investigation continued. The civil litigation arising from Terrell's wrongful conviction had resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement with Jefferson County and the state of Georgia, money that would help compensate him for the trauma and lost opportunities resulting from his incarceration. But Terrell and his family had made clear that financial compensation was less important to them than ensuring that similar injustices did not occur in the future. Much of the settlement money was being used to fund a foundation dedicated to preventing wrongful convictions and supporting other victims of prosecutorial misconduct. The Terrell Johnson Foundation for Justice had already provided legal assistance to dozens of defendants whose cases showed signs of the same corruption that had characterized Terrell's prosecution. At Harvard Law School, where Terrell was now a first-year student, pursuing his long-delayed dream of higher education, he was writing his first law review article about the constitutional implications of prosecutorial misconduct. His professors were impressed by his unique perspective and deep understanding of the system's failures, recognizing that his experience provided insights that could not be gained through traditional legal education. "Terrell brings something to our classroom discussions that no textbook can provide," said Professor Janet Williams, who taught a seminar on criminal procedure and prosecutorial ethics. "He has lived through the failures of our system in ways that most lawyers never will. His perspective helps other students understand that these are not just abstract legal concepts, but real problems that destroy real lives." The transformation in Terrell's life was remarkable, but it had not come without cost. He still struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance resulting from his time in prison, and he found it difficult to trust institutions and authority figures who had failed him so catastrophically. Therapy and the support of his family had helped him cope with these challenges, but the psychological scars of his ordeal would likely never completely heal. Jasmine Johnson had also been profoundly affected by her son's experience, becoming an advocate for families affected by wrongful convictions and speaking regularly at conferences and support group meetings. Her grace under pressure and unwavering support for her son had made her a respected figure in the criminal justice reform community. No parent should have to watch their child be destroyed by a system that is supposed to protect them, Jasmine told a gathering of other mothers whose children had been wrongfully convicted. But we cannot let our pain and anger consume us. We have to channel those emotions into positive action that will prevent other families from experiencing what we went through. Antoine Johnson's experience with his son's case had led him to become one of the most vocal advocates for prosecutorial reform within the federal government. He had used his position as Attorney General to establish new guidelines for federal prosecutors, emphasizing their ethical obligations to seek justice rather than simply secure convictions. The guidelines included mandatory training on recognizing and addressing prosecutorial misconduct, enhanced oversight of federal criminal investigations, and stronger protections for defendants whose cases showed signs of corruption or fabricated evidence. While the guidelines applied only to federal prosecutors, they had influenced reform efforts in state and local jurisdictions across the country. Our obligation as prosecutors is not to win cases, but to seek truth and ensure that justice is served, Antoine told a gathering of district attorneys from across the nation. When we lose sight of that fundamental principle, when we start caring more about conviction rates than about protecting the innocent, we undermine the very foundations of our legal system. Antoine's advocacy for reform had not been without political cost. Some law enforcement groups criticized him for being too soft on crime and too willing to second-guess the decisions of prosecutors and police officers. But his moral authority as someone whose own family had been victimized by the system's failures made it difficult for critics to dismiss his concerns entirely. The broader impact of Terrell's case extended far beyond criminal justice reform. His story had become a symbol of resilience and redemption, inspiring others who had faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles to persist in their fight for justice. Speaking engagements at schools, churches, and community centers had made him a role model for young people who might otherwise lose faith in the possibility of positive change. "I learned in prison that you have two choices when the system fails you," Terrell would tell these audiences. "You can let it break your spirit and define your future, or you can use your experience to fight for something better. I chose to fight, and that choice has given my life meaning and purpose that I never could have imagined." The criminal investigation into Kevin Morrison's murder had been reopened following Terrell's exoneration, with new investigators using advanced forensic techniques and fresh witness interviews to pursue leads that Coleman had ignored. While the case remained unsolved, there were promising developments that suggested the real perpetrator might finally be brought to justice. Morrison's family had initially been resistant to acknowledging that Terrell might be innocent, finding it difficult to accept that their quest for justice had resulted in the conviction of the wrong person. But as evidence of Coleman's corruption mounted and the truth about the investigation's failures became clear, they had reached out to the Johnson family with an apology and an offer to work together in seeking the real killer. "We wanted someone to pay for Kevin's death, and we believed the police and prosecutors when they told us they had found the person responsible," Morrison's mother, Linda, said during a joint press conference with Jasmine Johnson. "Learning that Terrell was innocent doesn't bring Kevin back, but it does mean that the person who actually killed our son is still out there. We want the real killer to be caught and held accountable." The collaboration between the Morrison and Johnson families had become a powerful symbol of how victims could work together to seek truth rather than simply revenge. Their joint advocacy for improved police investigations and prosecutorial accountability had influenced policy changes in Jefferson County and beyond. As Terrell prepared for his second year of law school, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a prison cell to Harvard Law School. The path had been marked by trauma and injustice, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and purpose that he might never have discovered under different circumstances. "I wouldn't wish what happened to me on anyone," Terrell said during an interview with 60 Minutes, "but I also recognize that my experience has given me opportunities to make a difference that I never would have had otherwise. If my story can prevent even one wrongful conviction or help one innocent person regain their freedom, then all the pain and suffering will have been worthwhile." The interview drew millions of viewers and generated thousands of emails from people who had been inspired by Terrell's story. Many were from other victims of wrongful conviction who found hope in his example, while others were from law students and young lawyers who wanted to dedicate their careers to criminal justice reform. Denzel Harper continued to handle Terrell's case as a source of inspiration for his own work, using the victory as a template for challenging other wrongful convictions. His law firm had grown significantly as a result of the national attention generated by the case, allowing him to take on more pro bono cases and expand his impact on criminal justice reform. "Terrell's case reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place," Harper reflected during a speech at his alma mater's graduation ceremony. "We have the power to fight injustice and give voice to those who have been silenced by corruption and misconduct. That power comes with tremendous responsibility, and cases like Terrell's show us what can be accomplished when we use our skills in service of truth and justice." The influence of Terrell's case extended beyond the United States, inspiring criminal justice reform advocates in other countries who faced similar problems with prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. International legal organizations had invited Terrell to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing his experience with audiences who were working to improve their own legal systems. As the third anniversary of his exoneration approached, Terrell was preparing to publish a book about his experience titled "Innocent Until Proven Guilty: A True Story of Wrongful Conviction and Redemption." The book would provide a detailed account of his ordeal, while also examining the broader systemic problems that had enabled his wrongful conviction. The advance reviews of the book were overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising Terrell's ability to transform a personal tragedy into a compelling call for justice reform. Publishers expected the book to become a bestseller and to further amplify the national conversation about wrongful convictions and prosecutorial accountability. "Terrell has taken the worst experience of his life and turned it into a force for positive change," wrote one reviewer. "His story is both heartbreaking and inspiring, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the fight for truth and fairness requires constant vigilance and courage." As Terrell looked toward the future, he saw a life filled with purpose and meaning that had been forged in the crucible of injustice. His wrongful conviction had cost him months of freedom and had inflicted psychological wounds that might never fully heal. But it had also revealed his capacity for resilience and his calling to fight for others who had been failed by the system. The young man who had once dreamed of becoming an engineer now dreamed of becoming a defense attorney and eventually a judge, using his experience and education to ensure that the system worked more fairly for everyone who encountered it. His journey from prison cell to law school had been remarkable, but he understood that it was just the beginning of a lifelong commitment to justice and reform. 5 years after Terrell Johnson's wrongful conviction was overturned, the Jefferson County Courthouse looked much the same from the outside, but everything about how justice was administered within its walls had fundamentally changed. The corruption scandal that had destroyed Terrell's life had also created an opportunity for reform that was transforming criminal justice throughout Georgia and serving as a model for other states grappling with similar problems. The courthouse now housed the offices of the Jefferson County Conviction Integrity Unit, a specialized team of prosecutors and investigators whose sole mission was to identify and correct wrongful convictions. Led by former defense attorney Michelle Roberts, the unit had already exonerated 12 innocent defendants whose cases had been tainted by the same corruption that had sent Terrell to prison. Roberts, a seasoned criminal attorney who had spent 20 years fighting prosecutorial misconduct, had been personally recruited by District Attorney Richardson to head the new unit. She understood from experience how difficult it could be to convince prosecutors to admit their mistakes, but she also knew that admitting errors was essential to maintaining public confidence in the criminal justice system. When we discover that an innocent person has been convicted, we have two choices, Roberts explained to a group of visiting law students who had come to study the unit's work. We can deny the evidence and protect our egos, or we can acknowledge our mistakes and work to fix them. The first approach might protect individual careers in the short term, but it destroys the integrity of the entire system. The unit's most recent exoneration involved Marcus Thompson, the same witness whose coerced testimony had helped convict Terrell. Thompson had himself been wrongfully convicted of an unrelated crime based on fabricated evidence planted by Detective Coleman, and his exoneration had provided additional validation of the corruption that had infected the entire department. I spent 3 years in prison for something I didn't do, just like Terrell did, Thompson said during a press conference announcing his exoneration. The only difference is that my case didn't get national attention because my father wasn't the Attorney General. But the same corrupt cops and prosecutors destroyed my life, and I'm grateful that this unit is finally holding them accountable. Thompson's exoneration had also led to his cooperation with ongoing investigations into Coleman's misconduct, providing additional evidence that was helping to identify other victims of the corruption scheme. His willingness to testify against the officers who had framed both him and Terrell demonstrated the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most elaborate fabrications. At Harvard Law School, Terrell was now in his final year of studies, preparing to graduate magna cum laude with a concentration in criminal law and constitutional rights. His law review article on prosecutorial misconduct had been published to widespread acclaim, and he had been selected to serve as a teaching assistant for the clinical program that provided legal services to indigent defendants. Professor Williams, who had become something of a mentor to Terrell during his time at Harvard, observed the remarkable transformation that had occurred in her student over the past 3 years. The frightened teenager who had been wrongfully convicted had evolved into a confident young lawyer whose understanding of the law was informed by painful personal experience, but guided by an unwavering commitment to justice. Terrell brings a unique perspective to every class discussion, Professor Williams noted in her evaluation of his academic performance. He has the rare ability to see the law not just as an abstract set of rules, but as a system that profoundly affects real people's lives. His classmates have learned as much from his insights as they have from any textbook. Terrell's academic success was matched by his growing influence as an advocate for criminal justice reform. His book, Innocent Until Proven Guilty, had become a national bestseller, spending 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and selling over 500,000 copies in its first year. The book's success had generated speaking opportunities across the country and had made Terrell one of the most recognizable voices in the movement for prosecutorial accountability. The financial success of the book had also allowed Terrell to expand the work of his foundation, which was now providing legal assistance to over 200 defendants whose cases showed signs of prosecutorial misconduct or police corruption. The foundation's lawyers had secured the exoneration of 8 innocent defendants and had forced improvements in investigative procedures in dozens of jurisdictions. Every case we take on represents someone whose life has been destroyed by the same kind of corruption that sent me to prison, Terrell told a gathering of donors and volunteers at the Foundation's annual fundraising dinner. We can't bring back the years they've lost, but we can give them their freedom and their dignity back, and we can work to ensure that fewer innocent people are convicted in the future. The Foundation's work had attracted support from celebrities, politicians, and legal professionals who recognized the importance of addressing wrongful convictions. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had agreed to serve on the Foundation's board of directors, lending her considerable prestige to efforts to reform prosecutorial practices. Terrell's foundation represents the best of American values, O'Connor said during her remarks at the fundraising dinner. It demonstrates that even the worst injustices can be overcome when people of good conscience refuse to accept defeat and work tirelessly for truth and justice. Antoine Johnson's tenure as Attorney General was drawing to a close as the presidential administration that had appointed him prepared to leave office. His 5 years in the position had been marked by significant reforms in federal prosecutorial practices, many of which had been inspired by his son's experience with the criminal justice system. The reforms Antoine had implemented included mandatory training for federal prosecutors on recognizing and addressing potential misconduct, enhanced oversight of federal criminal investigations, and stronger protections for defendants whose cases showed signs of corruption or fabricated evidence. These changes had been adopted by prosecutors' offices across the country, creating a lasting legacy that would extend far beyond his time in office. My son's wrongful conviction taught me that no institution, no matter how well-intentioned, is immune from corruption and failure, Antoine reflected during his final speech as Attorney General. Our response to those failures defines who we are as a society. We can either deny the problems and protect the status quo, or we can acknowledge our mistakes and work to build something better. Antoine's reforms had not been universally popular within law enforcement circles, but even his critics acknowledged that his efforts had helped restore public confidence in federal prosecutorial practices. The ethical guidelines he had established were expected to remain in place regardless of who succeeded him in office, ensuring that his commitment to prosecutorial accountability would continue to influence federal criminal justice policy. Jasmine Johnson had found her own calling in the years since her son's exoneration, becoming a leading advocate for families affected by wrongful convictions. Her organization, Mothers for Justice, provided support services and advocacy training for parents whose children had been failed by the criminal justice system. The trauma of having a child wrongfully convicted extends far beyond the defendant, Jasmine explained during a panel discussion at a criminal justice reform conference. Families are torn apart, communities are divided, and everyone suffers when the system gets it wrong. We have to address not just the legal aspects of wrongful convictions, but also the human cost of these failures. Mothers for Justice had grown to include over 2,000 members across the country, many of whom had been inspired by Jasmine's example to become advocates for reform. The organization had successfully lobbied for legislation requiring better support services for exonerees and their families, recognizing that compensation for wrongful convictions needed to address not just financial losses, but also psychological and social damages. The real killer in Kevin Morrison's murder had finally been identified and arrested, bringing a measure of closure to both the Morrison and Johnson families. Advanced DNA analysis had connected the crime to a career criminal who had been imprisoned for other offenses during the years when Terrell was being prosecuted for the murder. The arrest had vindicated everyone who had insisted that Terrell was innocent while also highlighting the broader failures in the original investigation. Detective Coleman's focus on building a case against Terrell had prevented investigators from pursuing other leads that could have led to the real perpetrator much sooner. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied, Linda Morrison said during a press conference announcing the arrest. Kevin's real killer is finally going to face trial, and Terrell Johnson has been completely vindicated. Our family regrets that we initially doubted his innocence, but we're grateful that the truth has finally come to light. The Morrison family's public acknowledgement of Terrell's innocence had provided an additional measure of vindication that had helped heal some of the wounds inflicted by his wrongful conviction. Their cooperation in seeking the truth had demonstrated that victims' families and the wrongfully convicted could work together in pursuit of justice rather than simply revenge. As graduation day approached at Harvard Law School, Terrell reflected on the journey that had brought him from a prison cell to one of the nation's most prestigious law schools. The path had been marked by trauma and injustice, but it had also revealed his capacity for resilience and his calling to fight for others who had been failed by the system. The commencement ceremony took place on a beautiful spring day, with hundreds of graduates and their families gathered on Harvard Yard to celebrate the completion of their legal education. Terrell's family occupied an entire row of seats, including his mother, father, sister, and various relatives and friends who had supported him throughout his ordeal. When his name was called and he walked across the stage to receive his law degree, the audience erupted in applause that lasted much longer than usual. His classmates, professors, and family members understood that this moment represented not just an academic achievement, but a triumph over injustice and a symbol of hope for others who had been wrongfully accused. Terrell Johnson has shown us that the worst injustices can be overcome through courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to truth, Dean Martha Reynolds said during her remarks to the graduating class. His journey from wrongful conviction to Harvard Law School demonstrates the power of education and advocacy to create positive change in our society. After the ceremony, Terrell was surrounded by well-wishers and media representatives who wanted to document this milestone in his remarkable story, but his thoughts were focused on the future and the work that lay ahead as he prepared to begin his legal career. The law firm where Terrell would begin his career as an associate attorney specialized in criminal defense and civil rights litigation. Harper & Associates had offered him a position immediately after his second year of law school, recognizing that his unique experience and growing reputation would make him an invaluable addition to their team. Denzel Harper, who had become something of a father figure to Terrell during their years of working together, was looking forward to mentoring the young lawyer as he transitioned from client to colleague. The firm's work defending the wrongfully accused had expanded significantly in the years since Terrell's case, partly due to the national attention his exoneration had generated. Having Terrell join our team represents the completion of a circle that began when he first called me from that jail cell, Harper reflected during a partners' meeting. He's going from someone who needed our help to someone who can provide help to others facing similar injustices. That transformation embodies everything we've been working toward as a firm. The first case Terrell would work on as a lawyer involved a 19-year-old defendant named Christopher Davis, who had been convicted of armed robbery based largely on a questionable eyewitness identification. The parallels to his own case were unmistakable, and Terrell felt a deep personal connection to the young man whose life had been derailed by what appeared to be another wrongful conviction. When I first met Christopher, I saw myself 5 years ago, Terrell explained to his colleagues during a case strategy meeting. He's scared, confused, and has lost faith in a system that was supposed to protect him. Our job is not just to prove his innocence, but to restore his hope and help him rebuild his life. The Davis case would provide Terrell with an opportunity to apply everything he had learned about wrongful convictions, both from his personal experience and his legal education. He understood the psychological trauma that Christopher was experiencing, the systemic failures that had led to his conviction, and the legal strategies that would be most effective in securing his exoneration. As Terrell prepared for his first day as a practicing attorney, he carried with him the lessons learned from his journey through the criminal justice system. He had seen the worst that the system could produce, but he had also witnessed its capacity for correction and reform when people of good conscience refused to accept injustice. The young man who had once sat in a prison cell, terrified and alone, was now ready to stand in courtrooms across the country, fighting for others who had been failed by the system. His transformation from victim to advocate represented not just a personal triumph, but a powerful example of how individual experiences of injustice could be transformed into forces for positive change. The story of Terrell Johnson's wrongful conviction and eventual exoneration had become more than just a legal case or a human interest story. It had become a symbol of hope for everyone who believed that truth and justice could ultimately prevail over corruption and misconduct. His journey from a prison cell to Harvard Law School demonstrated that even the worst injustices could be overcome through courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to fighting for what is right. As Terrell looked toward the future, he understood that his work was just beginning. There were thousands of innocent people still sitting in prison cells, convicted based on fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and prosecutorial misconduct. There were families torn apart by wrongful convictions, communities divided by injustice, and a system that still too often prioritized convictions over truth. But there was also reason for hope. The reforms inspired by his case were taking hold in jurisdictions across the country. Conviction integrity units were being established in prosecutors' offices that had never before acknowledged the possibility of wrongful convictions. Training programs for police officers and prosecutors were emphasizing ethical obligations and the importance of seeking truth rather than simply building cases. Most importantly, a new generation of lawyers, prosecutors, and judges was entering the system with a deeper understanding of its potential for both justice and injustice. They had been educated not just in legal procedures, but in the human consequences of those procedures, and they carried with them a commitment to ensuring that the system worked fairly for everyone who encountered it. The legacy of Terrell Johnson's case would extend far beyond his own exoneration. It would live on in every wrongful conviction that was prevented, every innocent defendant who was freed, and every reform that made the system more just and accountable. His journey from victim to advocate had shown that even the darkest chapters of injustice could be transformed into powerful forces for positive change. As he prepared to begin his legal career, Terrell understood that he carried not just his law degree, but also the hopes and dreams of everyone who had been failed by the system. His success would be measured not just by the cases he won, but by the lives he touched and the reforms he helped inspire. The frightened teenager who had made that desperate phone call to his father had evolved into a confident advocate for justice, ready to ensure that the promise of equal justice under law became a reality for everyone, regardless of their race, class, or connections. The truth had indeed prevailed, but the fight for justice would continue. And Terrell Johnson, armed with his hard-won experience and his Harvard law degree, was ready to lead that fight for as long as it took to create a system that truly served the cause of justice for all. Part 8, The Verdict of Hope. 3 weeks after oral arguments, the Georgia State Court of Appeals released its decision in the case of Johnson v. State of Georgia. The 47-page ruling, authored by Chief Judge Patterson and joined by Judges Hayes and Kim, represented a comprehensive repudiation of the conviction that had sent 17-year-old Terrell Johnson to prison for life. The decision would be remembered as a landmark ruling in the fight against prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption, but for the Johnson family, it represented something much simpler and more profound: the return of hope. The ruling began with a stark assessment of the systematic failures that had led to Terrell's wrongful conviction. This case presents a disturbing example of how corruption within law enforcement can poison every aspect of a criminal prosecution, from the initial investigation through trial and sentencing. The evidence before this court demonstrates that the defendant's conviction was obtained through a combination of fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and prosecutorial misconduct that violated his fundamental constitutional rights. In his cell at Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, Terrell was summoned to meet with Warden Phillips, a gruff but fair-minded man who had spent 30 years working in corrections. Phillips had seen thousands of inmates come and go during his career, but he had never had to deliver news quite like what he was about to share with the young man sitting across from his desk. "Johnson," the warden began, his voice carrying an unusual tone of solemnity mixed with something that might have been relief. "I've just received word from the Court of Appeals regarding your case. Your conviction has been overturned, and you're going to be released pending a decision by the prosecutor's office about whether to retry you." For a moment, Terrell couldn't process what he was hearing. After 6 months of living with the crushing certainty that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the concept of freedom seemed almost abstract, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. His hands began to shake as the reality of the warden's words slowly penetrated the psychological armor he had built to protect himself from hope. "Are you saying I'm going home?" Terrell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Phillips replied, and for the first time since Terrell had known him, the warden smiled. "Your attorney is on his way here now to handle the paperwork for your release. You should be walking out of here this afternoon." In Atlanta, Denzel Harper's office erupted in celebration as the news of the appellate court's decision spread throughout the firm. Harper himself remained characteristically focused, already turning his attention to the next phase of Terrell's legal journey. While the overturned conviction was a tremendous victory, the threat of retrial meant that their work was far from finished. Harper immediately placed a call to Attorney General Antoine Johnson, who was in a meeting with congressional leadership when his secretary interrupted to deliver the news. Antoine excused himself from the meeting and took the call in his private office, his hands trembling slightly as he answered the phone. "Denzel," Antoine said, his voice thick with emotion, "please tell me this is real." "It's real, Antoine," Harper replied, his own voice reflecting the satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. "The court didn't just overturn the conviction, they eviscerated it. Judge Patterson's opinion is a complete condemnation of the prosecution's conduct and the police investigation. She found that Terrell's constitutional rights were violated at every stage of the process." Antoine closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, feeling as though an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For months, he had maintained his composure in public while privately agonizing over his son's fate. Now, for the first time since that devastating phone call from the courthouse, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually prevail. "What happens next?" Antoine asked, his legal training reasserting itself even in the midst of his relief. "The ball is in Rebecca Sterling's court now," Harper explained. "She has 30 days to decide whether to retry Terrell or dismiss the charges entirely. Given the evidence of corruption and the fact that her key witnesses have recanted, I can't imagine she'll want to put this case in front of another jury." Meanwhile, in Jefferson County, Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling was meeting with her senior staff to discuss the appellate court's devastating ruling. The decision had not only overturned Terrell's conviction, but had also raised serious questions about Sterling's own conduct during the prosecution. The court had stopped just short of finding that she had knowingly used fabricated evidence, but the implications were clear enough to threaten her career and reputation. "We need to make a decision about retrial within 30 days, Sterling said to her assembled staff, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "What are our options?" Assistant District Attorney James Crawford, Sterling's most trusted deputy, had spent the morning reviewing the appellate court's decision and considering their limited options. "Rebecca, I have to be honest with you. This decision destroys our case. Every key piece of evidence has been discredited. Our main witnesses have recanted, and the court has found that our investigation was fundamentally flawed. If we retry this case, we're going to lose, and we're going to look vindictive in the process." Sterling knew that Crawford was right, but the political implications of dismissing charges against such a high-profile defendant were staggering. She had built her career on securing convictions and maintaining law and order in Jefferson County. Admitting that she had prosecuted an innocent teenager for murder would undermine everything she had worked to accomplish. "What about public safety?" Sterling asked, grasping for any argument that might justify continuing the prosecution. "The real killer is still out there. If we dismiss charges against Johnson, doesn't that send a message that we're giving up on justice for Kevin Morrison?" Crawford's response was blunt and unforgiving. "Rebecca, the reason the real killer is still out there is because Coleman and his team were so focused on railroading Johnson that they never conducted a proper investigation. We're not giving up on justice. We're acknowledging that we got it wrong the first time." The meeting continued for another hour, but the conclusion was inevitable. With the appellate court having found that the original prosecution was based on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony, there was simply no viable case to present to a new jury. Sterling would have to make the most difficult decision of her career, dismissing charges against Terrell Johnson and effectively admitting that her office had wrongfully convicted an innocent teenager. At Jefferson County Regional Correctional Facility, Terrell was gathering his few possessions as correctional officers prepared the paperwork for his release. His cellmate Curtis watched with a mixture of joy and envy as the young man who had arrived 6 months earlier as a frightened teenager prepared to leave as someone who had survived the system's worst failures and emerged with his dignity intact. "Remember what I told you when you first got here," Curtis said as Terrell folded his letters from home and placed them in a plastic bag. "The moment you walk out of here, you start fighting for everyone who's still inside. Your freedom isn't just about you. It's about proving that the system can be forced to acknowledge its mistakes." Terrell nodded, understanding that his release would make him a symbol in the fight against wrongful convictions and criminal justice reform. He had learned much during his 6 months in prison, not just about survival, but about the systemic problems that had put him there in the first place. His experience had opened his eyes to injustices that extended far beyond his own case. The steel door of his cell opened one final time, and Terrell walked out into the corridor that had defined the boundaries of his world for so many months. Each step toward the prison's exit felt surreal, as if he was walking through a dream that might evaporate at any moment. The sounds of the prison, which had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, gradually faded behind him as he approached the final checkpoint. Officer Graham, who had been kind to Terrell throughout his incarceration, was waiting at the processing desk with the paperwork for his release. The veteran corrections officer had seen many inmates leave these walls over the years, but few departures had affected him as much as watching this young man walk free after what everyone now understood had been a terrible miscarriage of justice. "You take care of yourself out there, son," Graham said as he handed Terrell his release papers, "and don't let anybody convince you that what happened to you was acceptable. You fight to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Outside the prison walls, a small crowd had gathered, despite efforts to keep Terrell's release time confidential. Jasmine Johnson stood at the front of the group, tears streaming down her face as she waited to embrace the son she had feared she might never hold again. Beside her stood Antoine, who had taken leave from his duties as Attorney General to be present for this moment. Behind them, members of the community who had supported Terrell throughout his ordeal waited with signs calling for criminal justice reform. When Terrell emerged from the prison entrance, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But all he could see was his mother's face, radiant with joy and relief after months of anguish. He ran to her embrace, both of them sobbing as they held each other for the first time since that devastating day in the courthouse, when his life had been turned upside down. "I knew you'd come home," Jasmine whispered through her tears. "I never stopped believing you'd come home." Antoine approached his son cautiously, uncertain how their relationship might have been affected by the trauma of the past 6 months. But Terrell reached out to embrace his father, understanding that Antoine had risked everything to help secure his freedom while maintaining his ethical obligations as Attorney General. "Thank you, Dad," Terrell said simply. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Denzel Harper stood nearby, watching the family reunion with satisfaction, but also with the knowledge that their legal battle might not be over. While the appellate court had overturned Terrell's conviction, the possibility of retrial meant that the young man's freedom remained tenuous until the prosecutor made a final decision about the case. "We still have work to do," Harper told the gathered reporters, his voice carrying both celebration and caution. "While we're thrilled that Terrell is free today, we won't rest until the charges against him are completely dismissed and the real perpetrator of this crime is brought to justice." The media attention surrounding Terrell's release was intense, with news crews from across the country covering the story of the Attorney General's son who had been freed after a wrongful conviction. But Harper and the Johnson family had agreed to limit media appearances until the legal situation was completely resolved. As the crowd began to disperse, the Johnson family climbed into Antoine's car for the drive home to Washington, where Terrell would begin the difficult process of rebuilding his life after 6 months in prison. The physical freedom was immediate and overwhelming, but the psychological effects of his incarceration would take much longer to heal. During the drive, Terrell stared out the window at a world that seemed both familiar and strange after his months of confinement. The simple act of traveling freely, of seeing trees and buildings and people going about their daily lives, felt almost miraculous after the controlled environment of prison. But he also found himself scanning the landscape with the hypervigilance he had developed behind bars, a survival instinct that would be difficult to shake. "It's going to take time to adjust," Antoine said gently, recognizing the signs of institutional conditioning in his son's behavior. "Don't expect to feel normal right away. What you've been through would affect anyone." Terrell nodded, grateful for his father's understanding. The months in prison had changed him in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. He had witnessed injustices that most people could hardly imagine, had formed friendships with men whose stories of wrongful conviction had opened his eyes to the scope of the problems within the criminal justice system. 3 days after Terrell's release, Rebecca Sterling held a press conference in Jefferson County to announce her decision regarding retrial. Standing behind a podium in the courthouse where Terrell had been sentenced to life in prison, Sterling delivered the words that would finally end his legal nightmare. "After careful consideration of the Court of Appeals' decision and consultation with my staff," Sterling announced, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "The Jefferson County District Attorney's Office has decided not to retry Terrell Johnson on charges related to the death of Kevin Morrison. The charges against Mr. Johnson are hereby dismissed with prejudice." The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community and provided vindication for everyone who had fought to prove Terrell's innocence. But Sterling's statement also included an acknowledgement that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "I want to express my regret to Mr. Johnson and his family for the ordeal they have endured," Sterling continued, her voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "While we acted in good faith based on the evidence available at the time, it is now clear that serious errors were made in the investigation and prosecution of this case. We are committed to conducting a thorough review of our procedures to ensure that similar mistakes do not occur in the future." The dismissal of charges meant that Terrell was truly free, no longer subject to the threat of retrial or the uncertainty that had clouded his release. But more importantly, it represented an official acknowledgement by the state that he had been wrongfully convicted, opening the door for potential compensation and civil litigation against the officials whose misconduct had destroyed his life. In Washington, the Johnson family gathered around their television to watch Sterling's press conference. When the prosecutor announced the dismissal of charges, Jasmine broke down in tears of relief while Antoine and Terrell embraced. The nightmare that had consumed their lives for nearly a year was finally over. But even as they celebrated this long-awaited victory, the Johnson family understood that their fight for justice was far from complete. The corrupt officials who had fabricated evidence and coerced testimony would face federal charges, but the systemic problems that had enabled Terrell's wrongful conviction remained largely unchanged. Over the following weeks, Terrell began the difficult process of readjusting to life outside prison. Simple activities like going to the grocery store or riding in a car without restraints felt overwhelming after months of highly regimented, institutional life. He experienced panic attacks, nightmares, and periods of depression as he struggled to process the trauma of his experience. With the help of therapists who specialized in treating wrongfully convicted individuals, Terrell slowly began to heal from the psychological wounds inflicted by his ordeal. He learned coping strategies for managing the hypervigilance and anxiety that had become second nature during his incarceration, and he began to envision a future that extended beyond the walls that had once confined him. Most importantly, Terrell discovered that his experience had given him a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. He began speaking to groups about criminal justice reform, sharing his story with audiences who needed to understand the human cost of prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. His articulate testimony before congressional committees and civil rights organizations helped build momentum for legislative reforms that would provide better protection for defendants and accountability for prosecutors who abuse their power. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," Terrell would tell these audiences, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand. "The system failed me at every level, from the police investigation through trial and sentencing, but my story also shows that the system can be forced to correct its mistakes when people of good conscience refuse to accept injustice." Denzel Harper watched with pride as his former client transformed from a frightened teenager into an articulate advocate for criminal justice reform. Terrell's ability to speak from personal experience about the failures of the system gave him a credibility that legal experts and policy analysts could never match. As the first anniversary of Terrell's arrest approached, Harper reflected on the case that had consumed so much of his time and energy over the past year. The victory had been complete and satisfying, but it had also highlighted the broader problems within a system that too often prioritized convictions over truth. Terrell's case was not unique, Harper told a gathering of defense attorneys at their annual conference. Every day, innocent people are convicted based on fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and prosecutorial misconduct. Terrell was lucky because his father had the resources and connections to mount an effective defense. But what about all the other innocent people who don't have those advantages? What about the people who are still sitting in prison cells, serving sentences for crimes they didn't commit? The questions Harper raised were uncomfortable, but necessary. Terrell's exoneration had brought attention to the problems of wrongful conviction and prosecutorial misconduct, but it had also revealed the extent to which justice in America often depended on wealth, connections, and the ability to navigate a complex legal system. For Antoine Johnson, his son's ordeal had provided painful insights into the limitations of a criminal justice system he had spent his career serving. As Attorney General, he had the power to investigate prosecutorial misconduct and hold corrupt officials accountable, but he had also learned that systemic change required more than individual prosecutions. We need to fundamentally rethink how we approach criminal justice in this country, Antoine told a gathering of state attorneys general several months after Terrell's exoneration. We need better training for prosecutors, stronger oversight of police investigations, and meaningful consequences for officials who abuse their power. Most importantly, we need to remember that our ultimate obligation is to seek truth and justice, not just to secure convictions. The reforms Antoine advocated were not popular with all law enforcement officials, but his personal experience with the system's failures gave his arguments a moral authority that was difficult to dispute. His willingness to use his position to push for accountability and reform helped establish new standards for prosecutorial conduct and police investigation procedures.